We've reached a tipping point in the various crises of war and austerity. Internationally, the working class are at breaking point. The ground is being set for World War III. That's literally how high the stakes are.
We know that they don't care about human life because what's going on in Gaza. This is our world, this is our lives you're gambling with.
Genocide in Gaza has killed more than 32,000 people and they left 1,000 more buried under the rubble.
I don't want to see any more children die at the hands of Israeli government and American and UK supplied bombs.
Young people who are suffering the loss of life that we've seen all over social media. These are our brothers and sisters.
We see it on social media because the capitalist media and the imperialist countries refuse to show these images. All corporate media are on the side of the mass murderers in Israel, repeating ghastly anti-Semitic lies to justify these crimes.
When I saw the Al-Shifa hospital being bombed and healthcare workers targeted, I spoke out on my social media. We were slandered, called anti-Semitic.
Et voir qu'ils sont en train de bafouer nos droits, en train de nous taxer systématiquement d'antisémitisme.
My great-grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and as a Jew, it would be unconscionable for me to support Israel's genocide against Gaza.
The situation in Gaza isn't an isolated issue. It's a warning to working class people globally. These are the lengths that the ruling class will go to ensure its interests.
இந்த யுத்தத்தை நாங்க சாதாரணமா பார்க்க முடியாது. இன்றைக்கு இதே யுத்தத்தை தான் நாங்க 15-20 வருஷத்துக்கு முதல் நாங்க இன்றைக்கு இலங்கையில் ஏற்பட்டு வடமாநிலத்தில் ஏற்பட்ட இந்த யுத்தத்தை நாங்க ஒரு
ஏற்கனவே ரஷ்யாவுக்கு எதிராக உக்ரைனில் யுத்தம் நடத்தி கொண்டுள்ளது. இந்தியாவில் மோடி அரசாங்கமும் இந்த சீனாவுக்கு எதிரான யுத்தத்திலே ஒத்துழைக்கின்றது.
We're all in the same situation and it's getting worse. We're all just trying to work, make a living, have peace. The only reason for these wars and fights is for profit.
The private profit motive is not working for the workers. Workers are losing jobs to automation. They could cut our hours, take away a lot of the physically demanding parts of our jobs with automation. But instead, workers are losing their jobs and the ones that are left are stuck with backbreaking work, longer hours. The technology is being used against us right now.
The billionaires are making money off of our broken backs and they're been doing it for too long. They only pay you enough that you need to work 7 days a week. Just another form of slavery. It's not just America, it's global.
The money is not enough. We have to work so many hours. We have to stay at the port continuously. We can't spend time with our families.
Die Industrie arbeitet gemeinsam mit der Politik zusammen, Kriege vorzubereiten, um Geld auszugeben für mehr Waffen, für mehr Munition, für mehr Ausrüstung des Militärs.
We're seeing these protests on campus in the US. They need to turn to the working class because the working class has the power to stop the bombs and the warplanes and everything from functioning.
The protests that are going on right now, you are doing the right thing. The workers should rally behind these people because a lot of us workers know what's going on.
We are the only power as a working class who can stop this genocide. We can block the tradeways, stop the production.
All port workers, we are in a good place in supply chain. We can stop the supply of weapons to this war.
We need to unite across geographic lines, across different continents.
As a child, when I first heard about the horrors of war, especially the Holocaust, I thought it would be my moral duty as a human being to prevent something like that ever happening again, to be on the right side of history.
There will be no world if nuclear war happens. We are all sharing the same roof and same ground.
No matter where you are in the world, we all share common struggles. That's what unites us. And the working class makes up the mass of the world. Truly, we bring the power to the economy. We have the power to liberate ourselves.
Nobody wants World War III. It's our leaders and ultimately capitalism that's driving this war.
We need a revolutionary movement to overthrow these governments because they are, leading us into a global nuclear disaster.
There needs to be a mass workers' movement like what happened during World War I. The Bolsheviks put an end to World War I.
We can unite and we can stop this.
Et je pense qu'on doit unifier justement cette opposition qu'il y a justement à travers toutes les pays, toutes les classes ouvrières de tous les pays du monde pour en faire de lance contre la classe dirigeante capitaliste.
We need to take a lesson from the history to build tomorrow.
We can make things better. We can't wait. We have to do this.
It's up to the working class, up to the youth. We have to shut down this whole operation of capitalism before it destroys us.
I'm standing in front of the historical monument for the Haymarket Martyrs, working class leaders of Chicago who in the 1880s were framed up and executed for a crime they did not commit. The International Committee of the Fourth International is marking May Day, the International Day of Working Class Solidarity. But what many workers do not know is that May Day had its origins here at Haymarket and in the 8-hour day movement that emerged after the Civil War. During the Civil War, Karl Marx had predicted the emergence of the American working class. In 1864, on behalf of the First Workers' International, he wrote to congratulate Abraham Lincoln on his re-election in the middle of the Civil War. Quote, "The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new ascendancy for the middle class," Marx wrote, "so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes." Marx's prognosis was quickly vindicated. By 1867, he was able to write in Capital that it was out of the death of slavery that a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War, he continues, what was the 8 hours agitation that ran with the 7-league boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from New England to California. In those years, Chicago epitomized the colossal growth of American capitalism and the American working class. It grew from about 100,000 in 1860, when Lincoln first accepted the nomination for president, to 500,000 in 1880. And it was an international workforce. In the 1880s, the city's population was 80% foreign-born or the children of foreign-born. In 1886, the call once again went up among these workers for the 8-hour day. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will, was their slogan. Strikes and protests erupted throughout the country on May 1st. In Chicago, a march drew 80,000. On May 4th, police violently attacked a follow-up rally in Haymarket Square. A bomb went off. In the explosion and police melee, 7 officers and 4 civilians were killed. Authorities railroaded leaders of Chicago's working class through a sham trial. 4 of those falsely accused were executed on November 11th, 1887. George Engel, Adolf Fischer, Albert Parsons, and August Spies. The convicted sang the Marseillaise as they were taken to the gallows. Spies' last words were, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." A 5th martyr, Louis Ling, was murdered or committed suicide in jail a day earlier. 2 years later, in 1889, the Second International was founded in Paris on the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. A French delegate motivated a resolution for a great international demonstration of May Day to mark the recent American events. Demonstrations were held throughout Europe and North America in 1890. The anniversary is marked each year thereafter. Russian workers first observed it in 1891, Chinese workers in 1927. It is high time to revive the socialist and internationalist traditions of May Day.
The International Committee of the Fourth International opens today's celebration of May Day with a call for action by the working class against the criminal policies of the imperialist governments that are leading humanity to a global catastrophe. The working class must come to the defense of the embattled people of Gaza and force the end of the genocidal war being waged by the Nazi-like government of Benjamin Netanyahu with the support of imperialism. The international working class must recognize the inseparable link between the struggle against the Gaza genocide and the necessity for a global movement against the reckless escalation of U.S. imperialism and its NATO accomplices in the war against Russia and preparations for war against Iran and China. The brutal sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives for the sake of the geopolitical interests of the imperialist powers must be stopped. American workers must take action in defense of student youth who are being assaulted by the police stormtroopers at universities and colleges throughout the United States. The same responsibility falls upon workers in all countries where anti-genocide protesters are under attack. The International Committee denounces the slanderous identification of protests against genocide with anti-Semitism, which has always been and is today the trademark of right-wing capitalist politics and a weapon in its war against socialism. The International Committee renews its call for the immediate release of Julian Assange from prison. The conspiracy against his democratic rights must be ended. The International Committee also calls for a global campaign to force the release of Comrade Bogdan Sirotyuk, a socialist opponent of the war in Ukraine and fighter for the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian working class. He was arrested last week by the fascistic Zelensky government. 10 years ago, the International Committee held its first online celebration of May Day. On that occasion, it offered the following description of the state of world capitalism. The political organization of society seems more and more to assume the structure of a prison for the criminally insane. But in this global prison, it is the sane, the great mass of the people who are behind bars, while the madmen, consisting of capitalist politicians, the professional killers of the state intelligence agencies, corporate gangsters, and the swindlers of high finance, patrol the walls of the penitentiary, shotgun in hand. The celebration of May Day in 2014 took place only 3 months after the Maidan coup in Kiev that was instigated by the United States and Germany. Assessing the events at the May Day meeting, the International Committee stated, "The purpose of this coup was to bring to power a regime that would place Ukraine under the direct control of US and German imperialism. The plotters in Washington and Berlin understood that this coup would lead to a confrontation with Russia. Indeed, far from seeking to avoid a confrontation, both Germany and the United States believe that a clash with Russia is required for the realization of their far-reaching geopolitical interests. For German imperialism, the confrontation with Russia is welcomed as a pretext for the repudiation of the constraints on militarism imposed in the wake of the unspeakable crimes committed during the years of Hitler's Third Reich. As for the role of the United States, the International Committee warned, there is an extraordinary level of recklessness in the conduct of American foreign policy. One or another of the confrontations provoked by Washington could spiral out of control with disastrous consequences for the United States and the entire planet. But Washington's reckless brinkmanship is, in the final analysis, the manifestation of the extreme crisis of American capitalism. The imperialist strategists in Washington see no other means to counteract the protracted decline in the global economic position of American capitalism other than through the mechanism of war. The fact that China, according to the most recent reports, is poised to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy by the end of 2014 will increase Washington's propensity to use military force to shift the balance of power in its favor. The events of the past decade have fully substantiated the analysis presented by the International Committee. But the confirmation of our analysis is not cause for self-congratulation. The analysis made 10 years ago was presented as a warning. But that of which we warned has become a reality. What began as a proxy war deliberately provoked by U.S. imperialism and its NATO allies has become de facto an open conflict with Russia. The Biden administration has ignored the red lines that, once crossed, lead to a rapid escalation toward nuclear war. A veritable war frenzy grips the leaders of world imperialism. In an interview published this week in The Economist, French President Emmanuel Macron again insists that NATO should not rule out the deployment of troops in Ukraine, declaring, and I quote, "We have undoubtedly been too hesitant by defining the limits of our action to someone who no longer has any and who is the aggressor." The political leaders and media pundits refer casually to a nuclear war as an acceptable strategic option. In an article published on April 24th, the New York Times, reporting on massive NATO military exercises on Russia's borders, speculated with remarkable nonchalance on the consequences of war with Russia. It wrote, "If NATO and Russia went to war, America and allied troops would initially rush to the Baltic countries Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, NATO's eastern flank, to try to block penetration by a Russian force. How that war would end and how many people might die is a different story. Tens of millions were killed in World War II. This time, the stakes have never been higher. Mr. Putin has brought up the potential for nuclear war several times since Russia invaded Ukraine more than 2 years ago." Far from attempting to lessen the danger of a catastrophic confrontation with Russia, the Biden administration and NATO are relentlessly escalating the conflict. Just one day after the report on NATO's military exercises, the New York Times informed its readers, Ukraine forces will be able to use a newly delivered, coveted long-range missile system to more effectively target Russian forces in occupied Crimea. President Biden's decision in February to send more than 100 of the longer-range systems to Ukraine was a major policy shift. The recklessness of this major policy shift cannot be overstated. The Biden administration would like the public to believe that the Putin government will not hold the U.S. and its NATO allies responsible for attacks by NATO on Russian territory with the weapons that they have provided. But what if Putin, invoking the precedent set by President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, declares, paraphrasing Kennedy's warning, that attacks on Russian territory by Ukraine with missiles supplied by NATO, and I quote Kennedy's words with certain necessary amendments, will be regarded as an attack by NATO upon Russia, and again the words of Kennedy, requiring a full retaliatory response upon NATO countries. It is high time for Biden and his NATO colleagues to tell the people that their pursuit of victory in Ukraine means risking nuclear war, and describe with the necessary detail what will happen to their countries and the world if the confrontation with Russia goes nuclear. In fact, the Biden administration knows very well, based on scientific studies conducted by the U.S. government in the 1950s and 1960s, what the result of thermonuclear war would be. In February 2015, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist published an article titled, "What would happen if an 800-kiloton nuclear warhead detonated above Midtown Manhattan?" What follows are several passages from that article, and I quote, "The warhead would probably be detonated slightly more than a mile above the city, to maximize the damage created by the blast wave. Within a few tenths of millionths of a second after detonation, the center of the warhead would reach a temperature of roughly 200 million degrees Fahrenheit, about 100 million degrees Celsius, or about 4 to 5 times the temperature at the center of the sun. A ball of superheated air would form, initially expanding outward at millions of miles per hour. The fireball would vaporize structures directly below it and produce an immense blast wave and high-speed winds, crushing even heavily built concrete structures within a couple of miles of ground zero. At the Empire State Building, Grand Central Station, the Chrysler Building, and St. Patrick's Cathedral, about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile from ground zero, light from the fireball would melt asphalt in the streets, burn paint off walls, and melt metal surfaces within a half second of the detonation. Roughly 1 second later, the blast wave and 750 mile-per-hour winds would arrive, flattening buildings and tossing burning cars into the air like leaves in a windstorm. Throughout Midtown, the interiors of vehicles and buildings in line of sight of the fireball would explode in flames. 2 miles from ground zero, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with all its magnificent historical treasures, would be obliterated. 2.5 miles from ground zero in Lower Manhattan, the East Village, and Stuyvesant Town, the fireball would appear 2,007 times brighter than a desert sun at noon. Within tens of minutes, everything within approximately 5 to 7 miles of Midtown Manhattan would be engulfed by a gigantic firestorm. The fire zone would cover a total area of 90 to 152 square miles, 200 to 389 square kilometers. The firestorm would rage for 3 to 6 hours. Those who tried to escape through the streets would have been incinerated by the hurricane-force winds filled with firebrands and flames. The fire would extinguish all life and destroy almost everything else. Tens of miles downwind of the area of immediate destruction, radioactive fallout would begin to arrive within a few hours of the detonation. But that is another story. This description of the impact of a single nuclear warhead on Manhattan is not speculation. It accurately depicts the horrendous effect of a nuclear blast. And yet there have been numerous statements by US and European leaders and high-ranking military personnel parroted in the media that NATO should not allow itself to be intimidated by the possibility of nuclear war. What this means is that the long-standing assumption that nuclear bombs operate as a deterrent to conflict between powers that possess them is no longer valid. If statements disavowing the principle of deterrence are taken seriously, and they must be, one cannot avoid the conclusion that decisions that could determine the fate of the planet are being made by maniacs. And yet, this is not an adequate explanation, nor is it correct. Biden, Sunak, Macron, and Scholz are not insane individuals, but they are leaders of a capitalist system riven by crises for which they cannot find progressive, socially rational, let alone humane solutions. The predatory character of modern imperialism, which drives it toward war and dictatorship, has long been the subject of Marxist analysis, which even predates the outbreak of the First Imperialist World War in 1914. The delegates at the 1910 International Socialist Congress held in Copenhagen adopted a resolution that stated, "The wars nowadays are the result of capitalism, especially the external competitive fight of capitalist states for world markets, and of militarism, which is the chief instrument of bourgeois class domination in the domestic affairs and of the economic and political repression of the working class. War will cease completely only when the capitalist economic order is abolished. The world war foreseen by the socialist movement erupted in August 1914. The historical significance of the bloody conflict was explained by Trotsky in his brilliant 1915 document, War and the International. He wrote, "The war proclaims the downfall of the national state. Yet at the same time it proclaims the downfall of the capitalist system of economy. By means of the national state, capitalism has revolutionized the whole economic system of the world. It has divided the whole world among the oligarchies of the great powers, around which were grouped the satellites, the small nations, who lived off the rivalry between the great ones. The future development of world economy on the capitalist basis means a ceaseless struggle for new and ever newer fields of capitalist exploitation, which must be obtained from one and the same source, the earth. The economic rivalry under the banner of militarism is accompanied by robbery and destruction, which violate the elementary principles of human economy. World production revolts not only against the confusion produced by national and state divisions, but also against the capitalist economic organizations, which has now turned into barbarous disorganization and chaos." There have been, of course, vast changes in world economy and the balance of forces among capitalist nation-states during the past century. The growth and complexity of the world economy and the scale of the productive forces upon which it is based are greater by several orders of magnitude. But so is, therefore, the scale of the crisis of the imperialist system. The American ruling class is determined to defend and secure its hegemony against all potential rivals. It arrogantly proclaims that it is defending what it calls the rules-based order, by which it means we make the rules and the world follows our orders. It has denounced those states which are perceived as a threat to the US-dominated world order, principally Russia, Iran, North Korea, and above all, China, as an axis of upheaval. A threatening and belligerent tone pervades the foreign policy journals that articulate the aims of American imperialism. A typical example of this genre is an article published earlier this month in the journal Foreign Affairs. It is titled, "No Substitute for Victory. America's competition with China must be won, not managed." But undermining the drive to global hegemony is the reality of the deterioration of the economic foundations of American capitalism. To put the matter bluntly, it faces the basic problem that has inevitably confronted a degenerate economic system: state bankruptcy. In 1971, the year President Richard Nixon severed the link between the dollar and gold, the U.S. national debt stood at $398 billion. In 1982, the national debt passed $1.1 trillion. By 2001, the national debt had increased by almost fivefold to $5.8 trillion. In 2008, the year of the Wall Street crash, it rose to $10 trillion. In 2014, the year of our first online celebration of May Day, the national debt reached $17.8 trillion. $17.8 trillion. By this point, the growth of the debt bore a morbid resemblance to an uncontrollable malignant tumor. During the past decade, the national debt has almost doubled and now stands at $33.2 trillion. The economic situation looks even more parlous when the public debt is measured as a percentage of gross national product. In 1971, public debt was 35% of GDP. By 2001, it had risen to 55% of GDP. 10 years ago, in 2014, the public debt was as large as the GDP. During the past year, the national debt reached 120% of the American gross domestic product. The deterioration of U.S. capitalism in relation to its global competitors is starkly exposed by the balance of trade figures. In 1971, the U.S. recorded a small surplus of $626 million. By 2001, the annual U.S. deficit had reached $377 billion. In 2014, the trade deficit reached $509 billion. In 2022, the last year for which there exists an accurate measurement, the trade deficit was calculated at $971 billion, just short of $1 trillion annually. The United States and its main NATO allies are convinced that the maintenance of their dominance depends in the final analysis on the destruction of their would-be competitors through war. The unfettered access of imperialism to the vast and strategical critical resources of Eurasia cannot be achieved peacefully. As one of the most astute commentators of the Financial Times of Britain, Gideon Rachman, has recently written, the Western Alliance is now a reality, a global network of allies that sees itself as engaged in a series of linked regional struggles. Russia is the key adversary in Europe. Iran is the most disruptive power in the Middle East. North Korea is a constant danger in Asia. China's behavior and rhetoric are becoming more aggressive, and it can marshal resources that are not available to Moscow or Tehran. Thus, the struggle against the relentless escalation of military conflict toward a nuclear catastrophe is the greatest task that confronts the working class. But the success of this struggle, upon which the survival of humanity depends, requires a strategy that is rooted in a correct appraisal of the nature of imperialism. All anti-war programs that are based on the hope that the ruling classes can be pressured and persuaded to accept a non-violent solution to the contradictions of world capitalism are self-deluding panaceas that block the development of a genuine mass movement against imperialism. The indifference to mass death and debilitation since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in January 2020 is an unanswerable refutation of appeals to the conscience of the capitalist class. It subordinated all concerns for human life to the relentless strive for corporate profits and the accumulation of private wealth. It accepted 27 million excess deaths as a necessary consequence of the operation of the capitalist process of production. The policy, joyfully proclaimed by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson as COVID ravaged the country, let the bodies pile high, is, from the perspective of the ruling class, no less appropriate in the pursuit of its global interests. The genocidal violence unleashed by the Israeli state against the Palestinians has aroused the anger of workers and youth all over the world. But it must be recognized that the genocide in Gaza and the war against Russia are interconnected fronts in the global war unleashed by imperialism. The same interests that dictate the policies of genocide Joe Biden in the Middle East determine the action of his administration in Central Europe as well as in Asia. History has demonstrated that the deep-rooted contradiction of global capitalism that gave rise to wars also lead to social revolution. The process of mobilizing the resources necessary to wage war compelled the ruling elites to escalate their assault on the living conditions and democratic rights of the working class. This will be met with ever greater resistance. But for this resistance to be equal to the historic task requires the development of a revolutionary perspective. The impact of the crisis will provide a powerful impulse for vast changes in the political orientation of the working class. But the necessary conversion of objective processes into revolutionary political action requires the building of a Marxist leadership of the working class. How will this be achieved? In his last great manifesto, written in 1940, shortly after the outbreak of World War II, and just 3 months before his assassination by a Stalinist agent, Trotsky defined the essence of the revolutionary struggle against war. And I quote, "Independently of the course of the war, we fulfill our basic task. We explain to the workers the irreconcilability between their interests and the interests of bloodthirsty capitalism. We mobilize the toilers against imperialism. We propagate the unity of the workers in all warring and neutral countries. We call for the fraternization of workers and soldiers within each country, and of soldiers with soldiers on the opposite side of the battlefront. We mobilize the women and youth against the war. We carry on constant, persistent, tireless preparation for the revolution." End of quote. Only the International Committee conducts the struggle against war on the basis of this socialist perspective. The strategic foundation of this struggle is the international unification of the working class, which can be realized only through irreconcilable opposition to the capitalist state. This strategy determines not only our opposition to the predatory policies of imperialism, but also to the retrograde nationalist policies of the capitalist regimes in Russia and China. The Fourth International, as Trotsky insisted, is the party of irreconcilable revolutionary opposition. We conduct the struggle against imperialist war not in alliance with any capitalist state, but exclusively through the political mobilization of the working class on the basis of an international socialist program. In a speech that Comrade Bogdan Siratyuk wrote just 3 days before his arrest, and which he had planned to deliver at this online rally, he declared, and I quote, "On the day of international solidarity of the working class, we, members of the Ukrainian branch of the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists, and the entire YGBL, call for the unification of the Ukrainian and Russian proletariat with the proletariat in the imperialist countries to end this war. We call for the construction of sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International in all former Soviet republics. And we call for the proletariat of the world to unite under the banner of its leader, the International Committee of the Fourth International." Let the words of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels sound louder and stronger. Proletarians of the world, unite. That from Comrade Bogdan. May his words inspire workers and youth throughout the world to put an end to capitalism and save civilization from destruction by building the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution.
Сегодня, в день 1 мая, я направляю свои поздравления и горячие приветствия международным товарищам и слушателям, которые вновь собрались, чтобы отпраздновать День международной солидарности трудящихся, берущий начало с первомайских демонстраций 1886 года в Чикаго и провозглашенный Парижским конгрессом Второго интернационала в 1879 году. В этот день международной солидарности рабочего класса я призываю рабочих и молодежь всего мира выступить в защиту моего товарища Богдана Сиротюка, основателя и лидера молодой гвардии большевиков-ленинцев на Украине. Богдан был арестован украинскими спецслужбами, СБУ, по сфабрикованному делу о нарушении территориальной целостности Украины на прошлой неделе. Ему грозит серьезный тюремный срок вплоть до пожизненного заключения. Единственным преступлением, которое совершил Богдан, была его убежденность в том, что Украина может стать по-настоящему свободной только через независимую борьбу украинского рабочего класса, действующего вместе с международным рабочим классом против империализма и войны. Он занимал принципиальную политическую позицию, основанную на марксистском понимании войны, выступая против фанатичного поклонения украинскому национализму, а также против реакционного российского национализма путинского режима. Как и все наши движения, он боролся за объединение трудящихся России и Украины с трудящимися империалистических стран, чтобы положить конец братоубийственной войне, унесшей жизни не менее 500 000 украинцев и десятков тысяч русских. Позиция Международного комитета и молодой гвардии большевиков-ленинцев в отношении этой войны укоренена в теоретических и исторических традициях марксизма. Для нас история имеет первостепенное значение. Без правильного понимания истории Советского Союза, его распада и установления новых капиталистических режимов невозможно разработать четкую и последовательную программу действий по борьбе с современным кризисом капитализма и угрозой Третьей мировой войны, фитили которой уже подожжены в войнах на Украине и на Ближнем Востоке. Объективная сила марксизма заключается в том, что он понимает историю как борьбу социальных классов. Капиталисты и рабочие – это не просто люди, находящиеся на противоположных сторонах предприятия, а классы со своими собственными историческими, материальными, антагонистическими интересами. Для нас социальная основа режима важнее, чем то, как он пытается выглядеть. Этот фундаментальный вопрос марксистской теории очень часто отрицается псевдолевыми, которые пытаются притвориться последователями марксизма или большевизма, но на самом деле поклоняются буржуазному национализму или империализму. Распад Советского Союза был не только результатом предательства сталинизма, он также стал следствием изменений в мировой экономике, которые привели к глобализации производства в 1980-х годах. Эти условия подорвали основы социализма в одной стране как практической политики сталинской бюрократии. Зайдя в тупик и опасаясь восстания рабочего класса, советская бюрократия решила вернуть СССР в мировой империализм. Распад Советского Союза обернулся кошмаром для подавляющего большинства населения. Повсеместная бедность, разграбление государственной собственности, бандитизм, огромный рост социального неравенства, разруха в образовании, медицине и науке. Короче говоря, страна переживала катастрофу, к которой обычно приводят войны и стихийные бедствия. Советский рабочий класс оказался разделенным и раздавленным. Империализм праздновал победу вместе с новообразованными российской, украинской и другими олигархиями. Сегодня распад Советского Союза вновь дает о себе знать, поскольку братоубийственная война на Украине, длящаяся уже более 2 лет, унесла по меньшей мере 500 000 жизней. Российская олигархия, продолжая сталинскую политику мирного сосуществования, полагала, что она может работать с империализмом как равноправный партнер, который уважал бы и признавал интересы российской олигархии. Даже сейчас Кремль работает в этом духе, несмотря на угрозу прямой войны с НАТО, и стремится заключить сделку. С началом опосредованной войны НАТО на Украине появилось много сторонников как режима Путина, так и режима Зеленского. У каждого из них есть свои аргументы в пользу поддержки одной из сторон. Но для них обоих нет классовой борьбы. Защитники часто любят говорить о том, кто ответственен за войну. таким образом переводя вопрос с существа дела на то, кто первый начал. Как правильно отмечал Троцкий, решающее значение имеет, следовательно, вопрос не о том, кто первый начал, кто явился агрессором, а о том, какой класс ведет войну и во имя каких исторических целей. Если угнетенный класс или угнетенная нация выступают в качестве агрессоров во имя своего освобождения, мы всегда будем приветствовать такую агрессию. Главный аргумент защитников режима Зеленского заключается в том, что он якобы защищает право на национальное самоопределение и ведет войну за демократию против диктатуры. Преследование товарища Богдана опровергает всю эту военную пропаганду. Всех, кто настроен оппозиционно к режиму, объявляют агентами Кремля и преследуют, угрожая лишением свободы или даже смертью. Режим Зеленского отказался от проведения президентских выборов и запретил все оппозиционные партии в стране, ввел антирабочее законодательство и принудительно мобилизует 500 000 человек во имя чуждых классовых интересов. Главный аргумент защитников путинского режима заключается в том, что он сталкивается с агрессией империализма НАТО и стремится защитить Россию от расчленения. Защитники путинского режима и его вторжения в Украину предпочитают не ссылаться на свою собственную историю, напоминая только о преступлениях империализма. Путинский режим возник в результате реставрации бюрократии и капитализма и реакции на Октябрьскую революцию 1917 года. Как наследник сталинской бюрократии, он унаследовал все ее контрреволюционные черты. Его основная функция заключается в защите завоеваний капиталистической реставрации от имени олигархии. Во время войны на Украине Путин защищает не Россию, а национальный суверенитет над банковскими счетами российских миллиардеров. Начало войны на Украине усугубило политический кризис в стране, который нарастает с каждым днем. Несмотря на положительные результаты президентских выборов, экономическую стабильность и успехи на фронте, страна находится в подвешенном состоянии, и одно единственное открытое действие правящего класса может спровоцировать невиданную доселе в истории современной России волну социального гнева. Экономика не выдержит еще одного крупного потрясения, а фронт не выживет без экономики. Правящий класс в России находится в тупике. С одной стороны, он находится под давлением империализма НАТО и раздираемый междоусобицами внутри олигархии. С другой стороны, он вынужден считаться с недовольством российского рабочего класса. Российская олигархия боится революции больше, чем империализма. Это слишком хорошо напоминает о том, что Первая мировая война закончилась в России приходом к власти партии большевиков в результате революции рабочего класса. Без сомнения, российские миллиардеры и политики, которые сегодня кричат о национальной безопасности, без колебаний попросят своих сегодняшних врагов из НАТО о защите от завтрашней революции. Борясь за возрождение троцкизма в бывшем СССР, молодая гвардия большевиков-ленинцев готовит почву для создания секций и партий рабочего класса, которые будут бороться за власть рабочего класса в противовес правлению империалистов и олигархов. Рабочие и молодежь в бывшем Советском Союзе сейчас вовлечены в гигантскую борьбу, от которой будет зависеть судьба не только отдельных режимов, но и всего человечества. Ни один буржуазный режим не способен разрешить кризис иначе, как путем войны и разрушений, поскольку это противоречит его фундаментальным капиталистическим интересам. Противоречия капитализма не могут быть разрешены в рамках национальных границ и на основе защиты частной собственности. Только международный рабочий класс, вооруженный программой мировой социалистической революции, сможет положить конец войнам и разрешить фундаментальный кризис. Однако для этого он должен бороться за свое единство со своими братьями и сестрами по всему миру. Сегодняшнее мероприятие – отличный шаг в этом направлении. Да здравствует Международный комитет 4-го интернационала. Да здравствует молодая гвардия большевиков-ленинцев. Свободу товарищу Богдану, за единство российского и украинского рабочего класса. Нет национализму и империализму. Вперед к мировой социалистической революции.
Здравствуйте. В первую очередь хочу поздравить всех, кто смотрит это видео, с Днем солидарности трудящихся и пожелать вам не опускать руки и головы. Все получится. Левое движение Украины, которое я возглавляю, сегодня находится в очень тяжелом положении. Оно запрещено украинским националистическим олигархическим режимом, который с 2014 года правит в нашей стране. Запрещены все левые социалистические и коммунистические партии. Их активисты и лидеры находятся или в вынужденной эмиграции, или в тюрьмах, некоторые убиты. Это сегодняшние реалии в нашей стране. И это на законодательном уровне. То есть в соответствии с нынешними украинскими законами, если человек выйдет отмечать 1 мая с красным флагом, он будет избит неонацистами, которые контролируются спецслужбой, после чего брошен на несколько лет в тюрьму. Таковы реалии. Буквально несколько лет назад умер основатель Союза левых сил Украины, партии, которую я возглавляю, Петр Толочко, всемирно известный историк, академик. Ему было 86 лет. Он умер, находясь под домашним арестом. В отношении него возбуждено уголовное преследование. Нелепое, глупое, абсурдное по государственной якобы измене. Несомненно, уголовное преследование ускорило его уход из жизни. Таких примеров я могу привести массу. Вы знаете о многих из них сами. Несмотря ни на что, мы не опускаем руки, не опускаем головы, мы уверены в своей победе, мы уверены в том, что в Украине победит по итогу, как бы то ни было, нормальный, здоровый социализм. Мы уверены в том, что впоследствии мы выведем Украину из дикого, страшного, черного угла, куда ее сегодня привела олигархическая власть и ее марионетки. Поэтому я хочу пожелать вам, уважаемые товарищи, крепости духа, передать вам всем, что мы с вами солидарны. Мы солидарны со всеми нормальными людьми, которые борются за права человека труда во всем мире. Я уверен в том, что придет время, когда человек труда будет получать продукт своего труда. И это будет справедливо, нормально, по-человечески, так, как мы того хотим. Я уверен, что придет время, когда все те, кто причинял человечеству боль и вред, все эти толстосумы, империалисты, олигархи, их шавки-нацисты, фашисты, обязательно в каждой стране будут отвечать очень жестко перед народными судьями. С праздником вас, с 1 мая!
My name is Will Lehman, and I'm an auto worker at Mack Trucks in Macungie, Pennsylvania. On behalf of American auto workers and the American working class, I want to extend revolutionary greetings to the brothers and sisters attending this May Day rally all over the world. This holiday is about us, the international working class, and labor knows no borders. Last year, many North American auto workers went through an important fight over the exploitative conditions that we confront in the factories. In plant after plant, workers had ratified strike authorization votes by more than 90%, demonstrating an immense desire to fight. Where the fight went wrong was where it began, in the hands of the UAW bureaucracy. The first action the UAW bureaucrats took was to weaken any strike action as much as possible. The stand-up strike was devised as a way of dividing us up and limiting any negative effect to automaker profits as much as possible. Workers need to study the international and historical experience of the workers' movement. As a class, we will not find a substitute for serious study of the past, and we can also learn from recent history. Last year, our fight was betrayed and dead-ended by the UAW bureaucracy. It is of immense importance that we analyze the struggle that we went through and draw the necessary political conclusions from it so we do not suffer the same losses again. What workers need to understand, one of the most important lessons from these past sellouts, is that they are not the results of the individual union leaders. The pseudo-left tried to make American auto workers believe that Shawn Fain was some sort of union militant who would reform the union. But as soon as he got installed in office in a bogus election, Fain arranged the sellout that is already causing layoffs and plant closures. The same thing happened in the Teamsters, where drivers were told that Sean O'Brien was a union reformer. Then he too forced the sellout contract on the workers. Fain and O'Brien are now busy making the rounds with Biden and Trump. The lesson is that the unions can't be made to represent workers by changing figures at the top. The bureaucracy represents its own separate interests from rank-and-file workers. It is committed to the profits and wealth of the corporations that it actually represents. Because the bureaucracy is committed to defending the profits of the corporations, it is committed to the increased exploitation of auto workers. When that does not satisfy the corporate profit drive, the unions are ready to support layoffs and plant closures. Like they are committed to the profits of their corporations, the union bureaucracies are committed to their own capitalist countries. That is why everywhere they are rallying to the cause of war, like Shawn Fain is in the US with his talk of making American factories an arsenal of democracy. What we as workers need to connect as a class is that the fight against exploitation is the same fight as the fight against war. The connection becomes easier to make when we pose the questions: in whose class interest does the war serve? And in whose class interest does the exploitation of workers as a class serve? The answer is the class that owns the plants and other means of production, the class that gets rich off of our sweat, the capitalist class. That is the same American capitalist class that is handing over the weapons to destroy Gaza and that is trying to launch a world war against Russia and China. Workers have to understand that in any major war, we will be the ones asked to sacrifice, and not only our wages, but our lives. The fight against exploitation in the factories and imperialist war abroad cannot be won by relying on the trade union bureaucracies and the two capitalist political parties. The lessons of both recent struggles and those of the past cannot be forgiven and forgotten. They must be thoroughly learned. And once learned, it is our responsibility to share those lessons with our coworkers. As we meet today, the Biden administration and both parties of the American ruling class are carrying out an unprecedented and dictatorial police assault on students protesting against the Gaza genocide at college campuses across the U.S. Over 1,000 youth and students have been arrested. Similar crackdowns are taking place in Germany, Australia, and internationally. As workers, we must rally to the defense of students. They need our support, and their fight is our fight. Brothers and sisters, we, the workers of the world, have the power in our hands to put an end to imperialist war once and for all. It is we who produce all the wealth of society. It is we who run the factories, the plants, logistics, and transportation. But we workers have to learn the lessons of history, and we have to recognize our own class interests and how to understand who is lying to us and who is telling the truth. The World Socialist website and the International Committee of the Fourth International always tell workers the truth. Again, happy May Day to my brothers and sisters the world over. Stop imperialist war, fascism, and dictatorship. End the exploitation of the working class. Build the International Workers Alliance of Rank-and-File Committees. Join the ICFI and take up the fight for socialism. Thank you.
I join with all my comrades internationally in sending our revolutionary greetings from the Socialist Equality Party in Australia to all those listening worldwide. The central task of this May Day meeting, which is the fight against imperialist war, acquires increased urgency as the world is closer to another global conflagration than at any point since 1945. Multiple fronts are developing in what are the opening shots of World War III. In Ukraine, NATO and the US proceed undeterred to prosecute war against nuclear-armed Russia. In the Middle East, the barbarism of Israel's war of extermination against the Palestinian people has now extended to its main target, Iran. Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria are also in the crosshairs of US imperialism. As this reckless and blood-curdling program of war extends, the preparation for open conflict between the US and China accelerates at a frightening speed. The fact that this is being spearheaded in this region by the Albanese Labor government must be a dire warning to the working class in Australia and internationally. The Australian Labor Party is the party of war. It has transformed the northern regions of the country into a staging ground for imperialist conflict against China while supplying arms to Ukraine and Israel. There have been 322 military shipments from Australia to Israel in the last 6 years. Based on freedom of information, the number of shipments per year has increased since Labor came to power, particularly in the 2022-23 year, despite denials by government ministers. The signing of the AUKUS coalition between the US, UK and Australian governments in 2021, targeting China, has been ratcheted up under Labor. The government has hailed the Enhanced Security Treaty signed between Japan and the US to ensure a more seamless command structure for war against China. With the agreement of the Biden administration, the UK and Australian governments have signed new military and intelligence pacts committing both to respond jointly if either is threatened militarily. This is in addition to the Quad Pact between Japan, Australia, India and US, the top-level Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, including Canada and New Zealand, all targeting China. Already permanent bases in North and West Australia for UK and US military personnel and weaponry have been established. Every announcement by the Defence Department is accompanied by increased military expenditure that is being extracted by cuts to government spending on social services, including health, education, housing and infrastructure. The working class is being forced to pay for the imperialist wars. During the COVID-19 pandemic, doctors in Australia who fought against government policy to allow the virus to spread and fought for health and public measures to ensure the safety of the population were persecuted and vilified. More than 20,000 people who died of COVID-19 after 2021, when restrictions were dispensed with, paid the ultimate price for those decisions. Today, in the face of the onslaught against health workers in Gaza, where hundreds of doctors and health workers have been murdered and hospitals destroyed, doctors here who have opposed Israel and the Australian government's defence of these actions have also been persecuted, doxed and investigated by health authorities. As Labor develops its war plans that place the Australian population on the front line of what would inevitably be a nuclear conflict between the US and China, it has tried to ram through the most dictatorial laws against immigrants in this country. The aim is clear: to deflect the anger and opposition of ordinary people onto immigrants. This is in line with the most right-wing and fascistic regimes internationally. Laws being enacted mean immigrants, including refugees, who are slated for deportation by the government, must either sign their own deportation orders or face anything from 1 to 5 years jail. If they still refuse to sign, they can be jailed again. Countries that will not accept their deported citizens will have their entire population banned from entering Australia. The countries already mooted are Russia, China, Iran, and South Sudan. It is undeniable that millions have been shocked and horrified at the genocidal slaughter being carried out by Israel against the Palestinian people, with support, funding, and arming by the US and other imperialist countries, including Australia. Protests have taken place globally and here have been sustained weekly since October the 13th. The protests are driven by a burning sense that one cannot sit by any longer and do nothing. It is an entirely justifiable reaction to the imperialist catastrophe inflicted on Gaza, and one which members of my own generation felt when confronted with the crimes of the Vietnam War. But protests did not prevent imperialist war then, and they won't now. The source of the descent into global war is the contradictions of capitalism itself, not the individual politicians who represent it. They cannot be appealed to because this is a system that cannot be reformed. The experience of the protests testify to this reality. As they continue, so too does the bombardment by Israel with bombs on Gaza supplied by the US, UK, Germany, and Australia. In fact, the F-35 bombers used to reduce Gaza to rubble would not get off the ground without the components produced only in Australia. Organisations of the pseudo-left, such as the Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alternative, and Solidarity in this country, promote the fraud that the governments prosecuting and aiding the war can be appealed to, pressured, and will respond to petitions and delegations. This lie only serves to tie the opposition to war to the coattails of Labor, the trade unions, and Parliament. Only a unified, independent, socialist and internationalist movement of the working class against war, which means the overthrow of capitalism, can halt the descent into barbarism and provide a future for mankind. It is that perspective that is being fought for by the IC in all its sections. I urge you to join our party. Thank you.
I am honored to address this May Day rally on behalf of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the student and youth movement of the Fourth International. I'm speaking from Chicago, the birthplace of May Day, exactly 138 years ago. At its founding conference, the Second International declared May Day to be International Workers' Day. This followed the frame-up of the Haymarket Martyrs, who were sentenced to death in a sham trial. The martyrs, who included George Engel, Adolf Fischer, Albert Parsons, and August Spies, had committed no crime. They were working-class leaders who had led massive strikes in Chicago, demanding an 8-hour workday. If they were guilty of anything, it was only that they possessed an unwavering commitment to the liberation of the working class from capitalist exploitation. This terrified the ruling classes, who saw to it that they be put to death. In that era, workers were denied their basic democratic rights. When they gathered together to strike or to publicly assemble for meetings and rallies, they would be openly attacked by the police, acting on behalf of the capitalist class of industrialists and factory owners who were responsible for the impoverishment of millions. Today, we see how democratic rights that were hard-won in decades of struggle are being stripped away as the ruling class has embarked on a new imperialist world war. In New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. At Harvard, Yale, and Emerson. In Germany, England, France, Italy, Australia, and Japan. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have joined protests calling for an immediate end to the genocide in Gaza and the occupation of Palestine by the US-backed Zionist state of Israel. Everywhere, the protests have been met with open police violence and repression. Millions of people have now seen videos of police in riot gear charging protesters, attacking them with clubs, throwing people to the ground, tasering them. Young and old carried off in handcuffs. At Ohio State University, police deployed snipers trained on demonstrators, creating the conditions for a repeat of the 1970 Kent State Massacre. In the US alone, over 1,000 anti-genocide protesters have now been arrested. These attacks have the full sanction of US President Genocide Joe Biden and all the members of both the Democrats and the Republicans. Biden has condemned the protest, slandering them as anti-Semitic, and has created a new police agency to monitor and attack the protests. He promised to put, quote, the full force of the federal government behind protecting the Jewish community, by which he means Israel and its right-wing Zionist allies in the United States. Biden's phony concern over anti-Semitism is exposed by the fact that, in smashing opposition to Israel's genocide, the White House at the same time works hand in glove with actual anti-Semites of the Republican Party, including those who advocate the so-called Great Replacement theory, which holds that there's a Jewish plot to eliminate white Christians from America. In addition, Biden has transferred endless billions of dollars worth of tanks and bombs to a government in Ukraine that celebrates as its greatest national hero, Stepan Bandera, whose followers enlisted in Hitler's mass murder of Eastern European Jews during the Holocaust. A special role in facilitating Biden's genocide and the war in Ukraine is being played by the Democratic Socialists of America, who include among their members Congressional Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AOC recently appeared at the protest encampment at Columbia University in New York to feign support for the protests. Just days before, she and Bernie Sanders joined Biden at a campaign event where they doubled down on their endorsement of his re-election. AOC held hands with Biden, the lead organizer of the genocide in Gaza and the war against Russia, and called for votes to support him. AOC and the DSA, which is a faction of the Democratic Party, are working to deceive you. They want to lead your movement against war to a dead-end trap inside the Democratic Party. Make no concessions to these figures. They are not for you. To all those protesting now, we also say clearly, students and young people cannot stop the genocide or imperialism alone, or through appeals to their campus administration to divest from the US and Israeli war machines. The fight against imperialist war and the genocide in Gaza can only be advanced through the mobilization of the international working class, the principal revolutionary force in society, which has the power to stop all weapons productions and shipments. The explosion of militarism abroad is incompatible with the right to free speech at home. The aim of this state campaign is to abolish free speech, not only on the campuses, but in all areas of social and political life in the US and internationally. As student protesters in the US were being brutally attacked by police in Ukraine, our comrade Bogdan Sirotik of the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists, which is affiliated with the IYSC, was arrested by the fascist-infested Ukrainian Secret Service. Just 25 years old, he is now being framed because of his principled internationalist opposition to the US-NATO proxy war against Russia. While it is the Zelensky regime that arrested him, political responsibility for his persecution lies with the NATO governments that back it, and above all, the Biden administration. The arrest of Comrade Bogdan and the mass arrest of youth protesting against the genocide in Gaza are interconnected developments. The fight against the Gaza genocide is a fight against imperialism, which, as Lenin stated, represents political reaction all down the line. The war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza mark the opening stages of World War III. As with World Wars I and II, this new imperialist redivision of the world is being accompanied by a relentless assault on democratic rights and on socialist and left-wing politics. The IYSSC in the US and internationally calls for the immediate release of Comrade Bogdan, and we pledge our full support for the campaign in his defense. This campaign must now be advanced forcefully as a central component in building a powerful socialist anti-war movement in the working class. That program is expressed clearly at this May Day rally of the International Committee of the Fourth International. Take the lessons you learn here today into your protests. The necessary strategy to mobilize the working class against war and against capitalism. Nothing less will do, and nothing less should be tolerated. Send delegates from your encampments to the factories. Talk with workers about their struggles. Link up with them in a joint fight. And workers, take up the defense of students. The attack on their democratic rights is an attack on your entire class. Mobilize independently of the union bureaucracies and both parties of the ruling class to immediately stop weapons deliveries and arms production for the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. Everything now depends on merging the fight against genocide, imperialist war, and the attack on democratic rights with the development of the class struggle and the building of a revolutionary Marxist leadership in the working class. The IYSSC and the ICFI alone fight this perspective.
I am here today to ask all those participating in this rally, all those supporters of the struggle for socialism, to donate to our fight. In 1938, the great Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky explained that the crisis of mankind is the crisis of leadership. This is as true today as it was 86 years ago. Across the globe, millions of people are beginning to mobilize against genocide and war. They reject the idea that there's any justification for the systematic bombing, imprisonment, and mass starvation of an entire people. They sense that what is being done in Gaza will be done to them by a ruling class that accepts no boundaries on its right to kill in order to secure its domination, and the vast wealth that it extracts from the blood, sweat, and tears of the working class. Anger and a willingness to fight, however, are not enough. The movement that is emerging in factories, at workplaces, and on campuses across the globe needs a leadership that has learned the lessons of the struggles of the last century, a leadership that opposes all efforts to sow division on the basis of gender and race, a leadership that tells the truth about the trade union bureaucrats and their support for war, a leadership that refuses to accept the idea that there is a lesser evil that can be found within the capitalist class. The International Committee of the Fourth International and the socialist equality parties around the world are that leadership. This movement and these parties must become mass organizations, and that requires resources to organize, resources to expand and develop the World Socialist website, resources to build new sections in countries everywhere. We appeal to you today to give and to give generously to this work. You can donate online at wsws.org/donate.
Ich freue mich sehr, auf dem heutigen May Day sprechen zu können und überbringe die revolutionären Grüße der Sozialistischen Gleichheitspartei. Denn dieser May Day ist von größter politischer Bedeutung und Dringlichkeit. Wir stellen der rasanten Kriegsentwicklung und dem giftigen Nationalismus die Perspektive der internationalen Einheit der Arbeiterklasse und der sozialistischen Weltrevolution entgegen. Das steht im Zentrum unseres Wahlkampfs zu den Präsidentschaftswahlen in den USA und auch hier in Deutschland in unserem Wahlkampf zur Europawahl. Wir treten der wachsenden Gefahr eines nuklearen Weltkriegs entschieden entgegen. Wir akzeptieren nicht, dass 80 Jahre nach dem Vernichtungskrieg der Nazis und dem Holocaust deutsche Panzer wieder gegen Russland rollen und die deutsche herrschende Klasse in Gaza wieder zu den Methoden des Völkermords zurückkehrt. Deutschland ist mittlerweile mit großem Abstand der zweitgrößte Waffenlieferant der Ukraine und eskaliert den Krieg gegen Russland immer weiter. Damit knüpft die herrschende Klasse nahtlos an ihre alte Weltkriegspolitik an. Es kann überhaupt kein Zweifel daran bestehen, dass der mörderische Stellvertreterkrieg in der Ukraine nur der Auftakt für einen umfassenden Krieg gegen Russland ist, der nicht um Frieden und Freiheit, sondern um Rohstoffe geführt wird. Der SPD-Verteidigungsminister Pistorius kündigte schon im Januar an, dass sich Deutschland innerhalb von 5 Jahren auf eine solche Konfrontation mit der Atommacht Russland vorbereitet. Heute verbleiben noch 55 Monate dieser katastrophalen Frist. Und um diesen Wahnsinn ins Werk zu setzen, wird die gesamte Gesellschaft militarisiert. Der grüne Wirtschaftsminister Habeck hat sich selbst in der Tradition der Nazis zum Rüstungsindustrieminister ernannt. Und FDP-Bildungsministerin Stark-Watzinger will Wehrunterricht einführen und Soldaten an die Schulen schicken. Zu welcher Grausamkeit die herrschende Klasse wieder bereit ist, zeigt sich in ihrer Unterstützung des schrecklichen Völkermords in Gaza. Sie unterstützt vorbehaltlos die Bombardierung von Männern, Frauen und Kindern und das Aushungern der gesamten Zivilbevölkerung durch das rechtsextreme Netanyahu-Regime. Dabei geht es nicht um den Schutz jüdischen Lebens, sondern wie in der Ukraine um blanke imperialistische Interessen. Und das ist wirklich der Gipfel des Zynismus, wenn die deutsche Regierung ihre neue Großmachtpolitik und ihre Unterstützung für einen Genozid ausgerechnet mit dem Kampf gegen Antisemitismus rechtfertigt. Aber nicht die Millionen Arbeiter und Jugendlichen, die sich mit den unterdrückten Palästinensern solidarisieren, sondern die herrschende Klasse knüpft wieder an ihre braunen Traditionen der Nazis an, wenn sie deutsche Panzer gegen Russland rollen lässt, Völkermord zur Staatsräson erklärt und die Bundeswehr hochrüstet wie seit Hitler nicht mehr. Die Kosten für diesen Wahnsinn werden auf die Arbeiter abgewälzt. Um die horrende Aufrüstung zu finanzieren, werden die Gelder für Gesundheit, Bildung und Wohnen zusammengestrichen und allein der Gesundheitsetat wurde inmitten der Pandemie um 2/3 gekürzt. In enger Zusammenarbeit mit den Gewerkschaften wurden zudem die Reallöhne im öffentlichen Dienst und in den Staatsbetrieben Bahn und Post um bis zu 25% gesenkt und so weitere Milliarden für Waffen bereitgestellt. Gleichzeitig geht die Bereicherungsorgie an der Spitze der Gesellschaft unvermindert weiter. Milliardengeschenke an die Konzerne und Reichen haben das Gesamtvermögen der 5 reichsten Deutschen seit 2020 um rund 3/4 wachsen lassen. Von 89 auf 155 Milliarden US-Dollar. Gleichzeitig leben mittlerweile über 14 Millionen Menschen in Deutschland in Armut. Gegen diese Politik des Kriegs und der sozialen Verwüstung entwickelt sich wachsender Widerstand. Denn Arbeiter in Deutschland wissen, was Krieg und Faschismus bedeutet. Und sie lehnen sowohl den Völkermord in Gaza als auch die Kriegsvorbereitungen gegen Russland in ihrer großen Mehrheit entschieden ab. Die Ampelkoalition ist die meistgehasste Regierung in der bundesrepublikanischen Geschichte. Die Kanzlerpartei SPD liegt in Umfragen unter 15% und die FDP droht an der 5%-Hürde zu scheitern. Aber die Regierung reagiert darauf nicht, indem sie irgendwelche Zugeständnisse an die öffentliche Meinung macht, sondern indem sie ihre ohrenbetäubende Kriegspropaganda verschärft und diktatorische Maßnahmen ergreift. Sie knüpft nicht nur in der Außen-, sondern auch in der Innenpolitik an ihre faschistische Tradition an. Für die Verhaftung Bogdan Sirotjuks ist auch die deutsche Regierung verantwortlich. die in der Ukraine wieder mit Nazi-Banden und Bandera-Verehrern zusammenarbeitet, um ihre imperialistischen Interessen durchzusetzen. Die Bilder der brutalen Polizeieinsätze gegen den Palästina-Kongress in Berlin und gegen das Protestcamp vor dem Bundestag zeigen die realen Klassenverhältnisse in Deutschland. Linke jüdische Kriegsgegner werden von der deutschen Polizei wieder misshandelt und inhaftiert. Und das im Namen des Kampfs gegen Antisemitismus. So soll jeder mundtot gemacht werden, der sich dem Militarismus entgegenstellt. Die faschistische AfD wurde zu eben diesem Zweck bewusst aufgebaut. Sie ist kein Fremdkörper in einem ansonsten gesunden Organismus, sondern das schlimmste Symptom eines durch und durch kranken Systems. Alle anderen kapitalistischen Parteien haben sie hofiert, setzen ihr Programm in die Tat um und bereiten sich längst darauf vor, sie in die Regierung aufzunehmen. Das gilt insbesondere für die nominell linken Parteien. Die ehemaligen Pazifisten der Grünen sind zu den aggressivsten Kriegstreibern geworden. Die Staatspartei SPD setzt den Militarismus in technokratischer Kaltblütigkeit in die Tat um und auch die Linkspartei hat sich hinter den Völkermord in Gaza und den Krieg gegen Russland gestellt. Was die nationalistische Abspaltung Sarah Wagenknechts betrifft, hat sie an der Aufrüstung nichts auszusetzen, sondern will den deutschen Militarismus nur unabhängig von den USA vorantreiben. Das zeigt vor allem eines: Man kann einen dritten Weltkrieg nicht verhindern und demokratische Rechte und soziale Errungenschaften nicht verteidigen, indem man Appelle an die kapitalistische Einheitspartei richtet. Die Interessen der großen Mehrheit lassen sich mit der Profitgier und den imperialistischen Begierden der herrschenden Klasse schlichtweg nicht mehr vereinbaren. Um Krieg und Ungleichheit zu beenden, müssen die Massen unabhängig ins politische Geschehen eingreifen, die Macht der Banken und Konzerne brechen und sie unter demokratische Kontrolle stellen. Wie Rosa Luxemburg am Vorabend des Ersten Weltkriegs betonte, muss die Arbeiterklasse die Konsequenz ziehen, dass man den Imperialismus, Krieg, Länderraub, Völkerschacher, Rechtsbruch, Gewaltpolitik nur bekämpfen kann, indem man den Kapitalismus bekämpft, indem man dem weltpolitischen Völkermord die soziale Revolution entgegenstellt. Und deshalb ist unser Wahlkampf von entscheidender Bedeutung. Wir treten der Kriegspropaganda und den Polizeistaatsmaßnahmen entgegen und kämpfen dafür, das Bewusstsein der Arbeiterklasse auf die Höhe ihrer historischen Aufgaben zu bringen. Und ich glaube, dabei ist dieser International May Day ein sehr wichtiger Schritt.
Chers camarades, chers amis, je présente les salutations fraternelles du Parti de l'égalité socialiste France à ce rassemblement en ligne pour la journée de l'unité prolétarienne internationale. En 2024, les travailleurs de l'Europe et du monde entier sont confrontés à la nécessité de lutter ensemble pour stopper une troisième guerre mondiale. En février, lors d'un sommet européen à Paris, le président français Emmanuel Macron a menacé d'envoyer ses troupes en Ukraine combattre la Russie. La politique agressive de l'OTAN a éclaté au grand jour. L'impérialisme menace non seulement le peuple russe, mais aussi le prolétariat international d'une guerre entre puissances nucléaires. Macron et ses alliés dans l'OTAN mènent leur escalade tête baissée, foulant aux pieds l'opposition des peuples. Selon les sondages, 68% des Français, 80% des Allemands et 90% des Polonais refusent l'envoi de troupes en Ukraine. Néanmoins, les médias en France et à travers l'Europe appellent à construire une industrie de guerre pour des conflits de haute intensité comme la guerre actuelle en Ukraine. Comme au début des guerres mondiales en 1914 et en 1939, le système capitaliste vit une crise mortelle. Face à des conflits internationaux et sociaux qu'elles ne savent résoudre, les classes dirigeantes foncent vers un désastre qu'elles ne tentent même plus d'éviter. En 2019, Macron a dit au magazine britannique The Economist que l'OTAN était en mort cérébrale, car elle risquait la guerre avec la Russie en Syrie. En 2017, Macron avait invité le président russe, Vladimir Poutine, au palais de Versailles pour des discussions cordiales. Mais à présent, Macron, lui aussi en état de mort cérébrale, veut jouer le rôle de premier fauteur de guerre européen. Le soutien de l'OTAN au génocide mené à Gaza par le régime sioniste démasque Macron et ses alliés. Paris a déjà vendu pour des centaines de millions d'euros en armes à Israël depuis 2012. L'automne passé, alors que le Tsahal bombardait des Gazaouis sans défense, Macron est allé en Israël embrasser le Premier ministre Benjamin Netanyahou, qu'il a traité d'ami. En encourageant le massacre de dizaines de milliers de Gazaouis dans des hôpitaux et des camps de réfugiés, l'OTAN ne vise pas seulement les Palestiniens. Ses visées dépassent même le Liban, la Syrie et l'Iran, aussi bombardés par le Tsahal. Les puissances impérialistes déclarent la guerre au reste du monde et surtout au prolétariat international. Paris est furibond en particulier face au mouvement des travailleurs et des masses rurales africaines qui l'ont contraint à retirer ses troupes du Sahel. Des dictateurs militaires au Mali, au Burkina Faso ou au Niger, cédant à l'explosion de la colère populaire, ont exigé le retrait de l'armée française. Ils ont invité en renfort les troupes russes de la milice Wagner contre des menaces d'invasion par des gouvernements africains alliés à la France. Le capital français et européen, dont les investissements dominent encore la finance africaine, ne laissera pas l'Afrique aux troupes russes ou aux produits de consommation chinois. Si Macron menace Moscou, c'est que les banques françaises rêvent d'un pillage sans entrave des ressources non seulement de la Russie, mais aussi de leur ancien précaré africain. Les travailleurs peuvent stopper l'escalade et arrêter la guerre mondiale avant qu'elle ne détruise l'humanité. Tous ensemble, ils peuvent bloquer les livraisons d'armes à Israël qui permettent le génocide à Gaza. Mais pour ce faire, il faudra construire un mouvement non pas national, visant à peser sur les calculs diplomatiques des présidents dans chaque pays, mais international, unissant les travailleurs de tous les pays contre la guerre, le génocide et le capitalisme. De riches leçons politiques découlent des expériences des récentes luttes de classe, telles le mouvement en France l'année dernière contre la réforme des retraites de Macron. Gouvernant ouvertement contre le peuple, Macron a imposé une réforme visant à envoyer des dizaines de milliards d'euros sur le budget des armées. Alors que les 3/4 des Français s'opposaient à cette réforme, il l'a fait adopter sans vote au Parlement. Il a envoyé des forces de l'ordre tabasser les grévistes et les manifestants, voire les passants, préparant la guerre mondiale à l'extérieur en menant la guerre des classes à l'intérieur. Les travailleurs voulaient lutter, mais Macron s'est appuyé sur les bureaucraties syndicales et leurs alliés politiques pour étouffer le mouvement. 6 Français sur 10 disaient vouloir faire grève pour bloquer l'économie, mais les dirigeants syndicaux ont sauvé Macron. Craignant ce qu'ils appelaient la folie qui pourrait s'emparer de ce pays, avec de la violence mais aussi un ressentiment social très profond, ils ont stoppé la mobilisation. En réalité, la folie de la société contemporaine vient non pas de la colère ouvrière, mais de l'irrationalité du capitalisme lui-même. En étranglant ainsi le mouvement contre Macron, les chefs syndicaux lui ont ouvert la voie à l'escalade militaire. La question décisive posée par l'expérience de ce mouvement est: quelle est la tendance trotskiste? C'est-à-dire, quelle est l'alternative révolutionnaire à la fois au capitalisme et au stalinisme? C'est le Comité international de la 4e internationale et en France, le PES. Le PES a appelé lors du mouvement contre la réforme des retraites à mobiliser la classe ouvrière pour faire chuter Macron et son État policier, comme première étape dans une lutte pour le socialisme. Quelle a été la ligne des descendants des pablistes qui ont rompu avec le CIQI en 1953 en arguant que les bureaucraties staliniennes fourniraient une direction révolutionnaire aux travailleurs? La situation n'est pas révolutionnaire, a écrit Révolution permanente, la fraction moréniste du mouvement pabliste français. RP a appelé à construire ce qu'ils appelaient un authentique contre-pouvoir au pouvoir de la bourgeoisie. En clair, un mouvement à l'intérieur du régime capitaliste. La nouvelle Union populaire de Jean-Luc Mélenchon a envoyé une délégation de parlementaires staliniens avec une lettre critiquant la réforme au palais de l'Élysée. Ce geste impuissant reflète le pessimisme politique réactionnaire de Mélenchon. Après avoir reçu 8 millions de voix aux élections présidentielles, il s'est abstenu de leur lancer tout appel révolutionnaire. Il a carrément dit qu'il servirait en tant que Premier ministre sous Macron ou même sous une présidence néofasciste. Quelle est l'alternative stratégique à ces forces politiques corrompues qui subordonnent les travailleurs au capitalisme et à la guerre? Un an avant l'éruption de la grève générale en France en 1936, contre les staliniens qui prétendaient que la situation n'était pas révolutionnaire, Trotsky a écrit « La situation est révolutionnaire, autant qu'elle peut être révolutionnaire avec la politique non révolutionnaire des partis ouvriers. Le plus exact est de dire que la situation est pré-révolutionnaire. Pour que cette situation mûrisse, il faut une mobilisation immédiate, hardie et inlassable des masses, sous les mots d'ordre de conquête du pouvoir au nom du socialisme. La phrase sacramentelle sur la situation non révolutionnaire sert actuellement uniquement à bourrer le crâne des ouvriers, à paralyser leur volonté et à délier les mains de l'ennemi de classe. Cette analyse éclaire la situation objectivement révolutionnaire aujourd'hui, 9 décennies plus tard. C'est là la voie à suivre pour mobiliser les travailleurs à l'international contre le génocide et contre la guerre.
No other imperialist country has seen more massive and sustained popular opposition to the Gaza genocide than Britain. Hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets almost every fortnight since Israel's war began. Up to 1 million demonstrated in a single protest in London last November, the largest that the country has seen since the demonstration against the planned Iraq war in 2003. Those protesting give voice to the anger felt by millions of workers and young people in the UK and shared with the billions internationally, watching the imperialist-backed slaughter of the Palestinians with horror. There are many reasons for the scope and tenacity of this movement. Generations of workers in the UK have grown up with a hatred of British imperialism, reinforced by its every bloody intervention abroad and its every assistance lent to the forces of reaction around the globe, including as Washington's chief partner in crime in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and now Gaza. They are part of a multi-ethnic class whose own origins are bound up with Britain's long and brutal history of empire. Many have had painful and personal experience of the weaponization of Islamophobia to support imperialist interests in the Middle East and attack democratic rights at home. And this includes substantial numbers of British Jews who have stood in defense of their Palestinian brothers and sisters against the torrent of lies and slander depicting anti-genocide protests as anti-Semitic hate marches. For all these reasons, opposition to the war on Gaza has catalyzed smouldering social discontent, especially in the younger generation. In the movement against the Gaza genocide, broad opposition to war, to environmental destruction, poverty and inequality, the criminal pandemic policy of herd immunity, and increasingly authoritarian forms of rule finds a focus. It is a movement that pits workers and youth against the entire political establishment. The Conservative government, whose 14 years in power have delivered nothing but war, impoverishment, the decimation of social services, and the evisceration of democratic rights, but also, and most significantly, the opposition Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer, which is now indistinguishable from Rishi Sunak's Tories. There is not a trace of exaggeration in this remark. The Labour Party has been careening to the right for decades. Nothing has halted it, including the election and 5 years of leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, who only served to confirm the total impotence of what passes for the party's left. But Keir Starmer has brought this process to its nadir. He will enter an election campaign this year, leading the self-proclaimed party of NATO, committed to war with Russia, having boastfully confirmed his willingness to massacre millions in a nuclear war, and standing in the front ranks of the supporters of Israel's genocide. He has expressed his admiration for former Tory Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, tied for the position of most hated capitalist politician in the British working class with Tony Blair, another of Starmer's idols. He has declared his intention to continue with the austerity economics of the Tory government, which have reduced millions in the UK to outright desperation, utilising the services of the trade union bureaucracy that systematically sabotaged last year's strike wave, encompassing over 2 million workers. Labour and the Tories confront the working class as a single party of war. Speaking in Poland last week, Sunak pledged to raise military spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030, lifting the annual budget by more than £22 billion. This was, he said, to place the defence industry on a war footing, in preparation for taking on an axis of authoritarian states, Russia, Iran, North Korea and China. And Labour has responded by launching a political arms race, with Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey railing that the Tories have shown time and time again that they cannot be trusted on defence. The development of a mass socialist movement in the working class in Britain has always depended on its rejection of Labourism and breaking from the stranglehold of the trade union bureaucracy on which the Labour Party rests. The conditions for this to take place are rotten ripe. Whether the Labour Party is elected to government as expected or not, its days are numbered, especially since it is most strongly despised by young people. The Socialist Equality Party and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality have intervened energetically in the mass movement over Gaza, confident that a major political shift is underway, opening the door to a rapid growth of the socialist movement. Against Labour's slavish loyalty to the super-rich, we call for the pursuit of the class struggle, in opposition to the pro-company corporatism of the trade union leaders, to secure workers' control of economic and social life, and a massive redistribution of resources to meet human needs in the UK and around the world. Against the escalating wars, we call for socialist internationalism and the solidarity of the global working class, a programme of strikes and blockades to bring the military machine to a halt. We have held a national series of public meetings to discuss this programme with workers and students, and to raise the vital issue of the defence of anti-war journalist Julian Assange, still held prisoner by the UK, pending extradition and trial under the Espionage Act by the US government. In the general election this year, we will stand candidates who will wage a campaign with the fight against war at its centre. The NATO-Russia war in Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza and the threat of a regional war against Iran in the Middle East, and of imperialist war against China. We will oppose all efforts to boost the Labour Party, including so-called Labour lefts, and all candidates who insist that workers must wait to settle scores with this right-wing, warmongering organisation and resign themselves to placing pressure on a Starmer-led government. This is the perspective put forward by the Stop the War Coalition, encouraging a vote for candidates prepared to declare for a ceasefire in Gaza. It aims to reinforce the propaganda of the trade union bureaucracy, whose leaders call for a vote for Starmer's Labour as a lesser evil to Sunak's Tories. We insist, and Gaza proves this, that there is no lesser evil choice available to workers when the Tories and Labour operate as a single imperialist party of austerity and war. We are fighting to build the Socialist Equality Party as the leadership of a mass socialist movement against war and the capitalist system that gives rise to war. We act as part of an international political offensive alongside our comrades standing in the European elections and the US presidential elections to build the International Committee of the Fourth International as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. This is how we honour the internationalist traditions of May Day.
Türkiye'deki Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu'ndan devrimci selamlar. Birinci Dünya Savaşı'nın çıkmasından 110 yıl, İkinci Dünya Savaşı'nın patlak vermesine ise 85 yıl sonra hali hazırda başlamış olan ve nükleer bir çatışmaya dönüşme tehdidi taşıyan bir 3. Dünya Savaşı'nın genişlemesine tanık oluyoruz. Bu felakete gidiş, uluslararası işçi sınıfının bilinçli siyasi müdahalesiyle durdurulmalıdır. Emperyalist savaş girdabı tüm bölgeyi içine çekiyor. NATO'nun Ukrayna üzerinden Rusya'ya karşı savaşı 2 yıla aşkın süredir şiddetle devam ediyor. İsrail'in Gazze'de 7 aydır devam eden NATO destekli soykırımına, İran'a ve müttefiklerine karşı savaş provokasyonlarının tırmanışı eşlik ediyor. Bölgedeki diğer önemli parlama noktaları arasında eski Yugoslavya'nın parçaları olan Sırbistan ile Kosova arasındaki ve NATO müttefikleri Türkiye ile Yunanistan arasındaki sınır anlaşmazlıkları yer alırken, iki eski Kafkas Sovyet Cumhuriyeti olan Azerbaycan ile Ermenistan arasındaki savaşın yeniden alevlenme tehlikesi sürüyor. ABD önderliğindeki NATO emperyalizminin saldırganlığına, 1917 Rus ve 1949 Çin devrimleri sonucu 10 yıllarca dışlandıkları devasa Rusya ve Çin topraklarını yeniden paylaşma ve Orta Doğu'ya tamamen hakim olma dürtüsü yön veriyor. ABD önderliğindeki emperyalist güçler, Şubat 2022'den beri Rusya'yı askeri olarak yenilgiye uğratma, Moskova'da bir rejim değişikliği gerçekleştirmek ve kaynak zengini bu devasa ülkeyi kendilerine tamamen tabi kılma hedeflerine ulaşamazken, NATO birliklerinin savaş alanına sürülmesi ve nükleer silahların kullanılması giderek yaklaşan bir olasılıktır. NATO'nun 1990'lardan bu yana doğuya doğru saldırgan bir şekilde genişlemesinin ve Ukrayna'yı Rusya'ya karşı bir saldırı merkezine dönüştürmesinin sonucu olan bu savaş, aynı zamanda Stalinist bürokrasinin Ekim devrimine yönelik nihai ihanetiyle 1991'de Sovyetler Birliği'nin dağıtmasının korkunç bedelidir. İlk aşamalarına tanık olduğumuz küresel savaşın Orta Doğu cephesinde 10 yıllardır devam eden kıyım, bölgedeki emperyalizm yanlısı gerici rejimlerin, Türkiye, Arap devletleri ve İsrail'deki Siyonist rejimin suç ortaklığıyla mümkün olmuştur. 1991 öncesinde NATO'nun SSCB'ye karşı bir ileri karakolu işlevi gören Türkiye'nin egemen sınıfı, Sovyet sonrası dönemde de Orta Doğu'da ve Rusya'ya karşı emperyalist saldırganlığın kritik bir bölgesel destekçisi olmuştur. Türkiye egemen sınıfı 1990-91 Körfez Savaşı'ndan Yugoslavya'nın parçalanmasına ve 1999'da Sırbistan'ın bombalanmasına, 2001'de Afganistan'ın ve 2003'te Irak'ın istila edilmesine ve 2011'de Tunus'ta ve Mısır'da meydana gelen devrimci işçi sınıfı ayaklanmalarının ortasında Libya ve Suriye'de emperyalist rejim değişikliği savaşlarının kışkırtılmasına suç ortaklığı yapmıştır. Bu savaşlarda milyonlarca insan hayatını kaybederken 10 milyonlarcası sığınmacı haline gelmiştir. Aynı dönemde Türkiye egemen sınıfının Kürt halkının meşru demokratik özlemlerine devlet baskısından başka verecek bir yanıtının olmamasıyla şiddetlenen iç savaşta 10 binlerce kişi ölmüştür. Ankara'nın Orta Doğu'daki emperyalist saldırganlıkla işbirliği yapması Kürt sorununu daha da derinleştirmiştir. Bugün İran ve Rus kuvvetlerinin de bulunduğu Suriye'de Türk kuvvetleriyle ABD destekli Kürt milliyetçi milisler arasında geniş çaplı bir savaş tehlikesi devam etmektedir. Aynı zamanda Türkiye'de binlerce Kürt siyasetçi temel demokratik hakları ihlal edilerek hapsedilmeye devam ediyor. Bölgede Kürt halkı Türkiye, İran, Irak ve Suriye'de yaşıyor ve doğası gereği uluslararası bir karaktere sahip olan Kürt sorunun ulusal temelde bir çözümü bulunmuyor. İleriye giden yol, Orta Doğu'da tarihsel olarak iflas ettiği kanıtlanmış olan ulus devlet sistemi yerine ulusal baskıya son verecek ve demokratik hakları güvence altına alacak bir sosyalist federasyondan geçmektedir. İran'a ve Rusya'ya karşı emperyalist saldırganlık kendi çıkarlarını da tehdit etmesine ve Türkiye'yi de savaş girdabına çekmesine karşın Türk burjuvasının ABD ve Avrupa emperyalizmine göbekten bağlılığı, onun burjuva milliyetçiliği çerçevesinde çözümü olmayan bir açmaza sokmaktadır. Dünyanın dört bir yanındaki geç kapitalist gelişmeye sahip ülkelerin burjuvazisi gibi, Türk burjuvazisinin de başlıca korkusu, işçi sınıfından gelen devrim tehlikesidir. Ve bu tehlikeye karşı başlıca müttefiklerini emperyalist merkezlerde görmektedir. Aynı nesnel sınıfsal konu, emperyalizmin doğrudan hedefi ya da müttefiki konumunda olsun, ister Filistinli ister Kürt, burjuva milliyetçi hareketler için de geçerlidir. Emperyalizme karşı uluslararası işçi sınıfına seslenmekten doğalları gereği aciz olan tüm burjuva milliyetçi rejimler ve hareketler, her zaman sorunun kaynağı olan kapitalist ulus devlet sistemi içinde emperyalizmle uzlaşma arayışına dayanan gerici manevralara tabidirler. Rus devriminin iki önlerinden biri ve 4. Enternasyonel'in kurucusu Lev Troçki'nin sürekli devrim teorisinde açıkladığı ve 20. ve 21. yüzyıl tarihinin kanıtladığı üzere emperyalizmden bağımsızlık ve demokratik bir rejimin kurulması, uluslararası sosyalist devrimin bir parçası olarak işçi sınıfının iktidarı almasını gerektirmektedir. İsrail'deki Siyonist rejimin Gazze'deki Filistinlilere yönelik soykırımı, tüm NATO ve müttefiki ülkelerde olduğu gibi Türkiye'de de hükümetin suç ortaklığını göz önüne sermiştir. Cumhurbaşkanı Recep Tayyip Erdoğan hükümeti, Netanyahu'ya yönelik retorik eleştirileri ne olursa olsun, İsrail'in Filistinlilere karşı savaşını besleyen ihracatı sürdürerek, emperyalizmin ve Siyonizmin bir işbirlikçisi olarak ifşa olmuştur. Dahası Erdoğan, Türkiye'de İsrail'e destek sağlayan ABD NATO üslerine ev sahipliği yapmaya devam etmektedir. Fiili grev dalgalarına yol açan hayat pahalılığı ve artan toplumsal eşitsizlik koşullarında, halkın ezici çoğunluğunun emperyalizm ve Siyonizm karşıtı ve Filistin yanlısı duyarlılığına karşın Erdoğan'ın bu politikayı sürdürmesi, iktidardaki Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi'nin geçtiğimiz Mart ayındaki yerel seçimlerde milyonlarca oy kaybederek ilk kez ikinci parti konumuna düşmesinde önemli bir etmendi. Ancak emperyalizmle ve Siyonizmle askeri stratejik ittifak konusunda Erdoğan ile burjuva rakipleri arasında bir anlaşmazlık yoktur. Hükümete yönelik halk muhalefetinin hak etmeyen faydalanıcısı olarak birinci parti olan Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, Rusya'ya karşı tırmanan saldırganlığın bir parçası olarak Finlandiya ve İsveç'in NATO üyeliğine tam destek vermiştir. CHP, Gazze soykırımının ve İran'a karşı saldırganlığın arkasındaki başlıca emperyalist merkezler olan Washington ve Berlin ile sıkı bağlara sahiptir. Türkiye 2024'te savunma bütçesini neredeyse ikiye katlayarak yaklaşık 40 milyar dolara çıkarmıştır. Militarizmin yükselişine ve savaş hazırlıklarına içeride işçi sınıfına karşı sınıf savaşı eşlik etmektedir. Erdoğan hükümetiyle burjuva muhalefet, işçi sınıfına karşı acımasız bir kapitalist sosyal saldırı programının uygulanması ve işçi direnişlerinin kendi denetimlerindeki sendikal aykırılıklar veya diğer araçlar yoluyla bastırılması konusunda da hemfikirdir. Nisan ayının başında başkent Ankara'nın AKP yönetimindeki Altındağ Belediyesi'nin temizlik işçileri fiili greve gidince, CHP'li Büyükşehir Belediyesi kendi araçlarıyla çöpleri toplatarak grev kırıcılığına girişti. Erdoğan hükümetinin Türkiye'nin İsrail'le ticaretini sona erdirmemesine yönelik protestolar şiddetli polis saldırısıyla karşılaştı. Amerikan polisi ABD destekli Gazze soykırımına cesurca karşı çıkan üniversite öğrencilerini şiddetle bastırmaya çalışırken, İstanbul'u ziyaret eden Almanya Cumhurbaşkanı Frank-Walter Steinmeier'i Almanya'nın soykırımdaki suç ortaklığı nedeniyle protesto eden göstericiler Türk polisinin saldırısına uğradı. O sırada Steinmeier'i dostça karşılayan ve ona eşlik edenler arasında sahte sol partilerin de desteklediği CHP'li İstanbul Büyükşehir Belediye Başkanı Ekrem İmamoğlu da vardı. Bu durum Egemen seçkinler arasında savaş karşıtı ya da demokratik hakları savunabilecek bir hizbin olmadığının altını çizmektedir. Buna karşılık geçtiğimiz Ekim ayından beri Gazze'deki soykırıma karşı devam eden küresel protestolar, savaşa karşı devasa bir toplumsal muhalefetin var olduğunu ortaya koymuştur. Bu muhalefetin işçi sınıfına yöneltilmesi ve net bir uluslararası sosyalist stratejiyle donatılması gerekmektedir. Egemen sınıfın pandemiden ölümü ve güçten düşmeyi normalleştirmesine, soykırımı ve nükleer savaşı normalleştirmesine, sosyalizmin normalleştirilmesiyle yanıt verilmelidir. Emperyalist ya da kapitalist hükümetlere savaşı ve soykırımı durdurma yönünde baskı yapma politikasının ya da barışçıl bir emperyalizm dönemine ulaşma iddialarının iflas ettiği anlaşılmalıdır. Büyük Marksist önderler Vladimir Lenin ve Lev Troçkin'in açıkladığı gibi, emperyalist savaşın nedenleri politikacıların öznel niyetlerinde değil, maddi sınıfsal çıkarlarda ve kapitalist sistemin çözümsüz çelişkilerinde yatmaktadır. Kapitalizm var olduğu sürece emperyalist savaşlar da var olacaktır. Dahası İsrail'in Filistinlilere yönelik soykırımı, İran'a ve Rusya'ya karşı savaş ve Çin'e karşı savaş hazırlıkları sadece bu ülkelerin ya da bölgelerin işçilerinin mücadelesiyle durdurulamaz. Bu bölgelerin işçilerinin en iyi müttefikleri ABD başta olmak üzere emperyalist merkezlerdeki işçi sınıfıdır. 1917'de Rusya'da başlayan sosyalist devrim birleşik bir küresel süreç olarak kavranmalıdır. Bu dünya devriminin başarısı ve eklemek gerekir ki insan uygarlığının varlığı her şeyden çok ABD'de ve Avrupa'da işçi sınıfının iktidarı almasına ve emperyalist saldırganlığın kökünü kurutacak adımlar atmasına bağlıdır. Türkiye'deki sosyalistleştik grubu olarak bu kritik 1 Mayıs'ta Orta Doğu'nun dört bir yanındaki işçilere ve gençlere sesleniyoruz. Soykırımı ve emperyalist savaşı durdurmak ve bunların kaynağı olan dünya kapitalizmini ortadan kaldırmak için uluslararası sosyalizm mücadelesinde bize katılın. 4. Enternasyonel'in Uluslararası Komitesi'ni küresel savaş karşıtı ve sosyalist hareketin merkezi olarak inşa edin.
සහෝදරවරුනි අධිරාජ්‍යවාදීන්ගේ පිටුබලය සහිතව ඊශ්‍රායලය ගාසා තීරයේ ජනසංහාරක යුද්ධයක් ගෙනියනවා. ඒකට සම්බන්ධිතව මැද පෙරදිග වඩා පුළුල් යුද්ධයක් දැසට යන වර්ධනයන් අපි අත්දකිනවා. ඒ වගේම යුක්‍රේනය ඇතුලේ රුසියාවට එරෙහිව එක්සත් ජනපද නැටෝ යුද්ධය උස්සන්න කෙරෙනවා. චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපදයේ යුද සූදානම ඉදිරියට යනවා. මේ සියලු වර්ධනයන් මගින් තීව්‍ර කෙරෙන න්‍යෂ්ටික තුන්වන ලෝක යුද්ධයක වැඩෙන අර්බුදය ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ, ඉන්දියාවේ හා සමස්තයක් හැටියට දකුණු ආසියාවේම දේශපාලන තත්ත්වය බොහෝ සෙයින් හැඩගස්සනවා. ඉන්දියාවේ අගමැති නරේන්ද්‍ර මෝදි ඉන්දියාව චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද යුද ධාවනයේ පෙරමුණු රාජ්‍යයක් බවට පත් කරලා තියෙනවා. එක්සත් ජනපදය සමග ඉන්දියාවට පවතින මිලිටරි මූලෝපායික හවුල්කාරීත්වය සහ ටෙල් අයුව සමග එයට පවතින සමීප සබඳතා සමග ගැළපෙන ආකාරයට මෝදි ආණ්ඩුව ආරම්භයේ ඉඳන්ම ගාසා තීරයේ ඊශ්‍රායලයේ ගෙන යන මේ ජනසංහාරක යුද්ධයට මුළුමනින්ම සහයෝගය දීලා තියෙනවා. ඉන්දියාව එක්සත් ජනපදයේ සමග සහයෝගයෙන් ශ්‍රී ලංකාව ඇතුළු දකුණු ආසියාවේ රටවල් චීනයට එරෙහි ඔවුන්ගේ මිලිටරි මූලෝපායික ප්‍රහාරාත්මක ව්‍යාපාරයට ඒකාග්‍ර කරන්න වැඩ කරනවා. ඒකේ ප්‍රතිඵලයක් හැටියට සමස්ත දකුණු ආසියානු කලාපයම න්‍යෂ්ටික තුන්වන ලෝක යුද්ධයක් කරා ගමන් කළ හැකි තියුණු වන භූදේශපාලන ආතතීන්ගෙන් යුක්ත වාසුලිය තුලට වැඩ වඩා ඇද ගන්නවා. දකුණු ආසියාවේ කම්පරුවෝ හා තරුණයෝ මේ වර්ධනයන්ගෙන් උකහා ගන්න ඕන මූලික දේශපාලන නිගමනය වෙන්නේ 4 වෙනි ජාත්‍යන්තරයේ ජාත්‍යන්තර කමිටුව විසින් නායකත්වයේ දෙනු ලබන සමාජවාදී පිළිවෙත් මත පාදක වුණු ජාත්‍යන්තර යුද විරෝධී ව්‍යාපාරයක් ගොඩනැගීමේ අවශ්‍යතාවයි. මෝදිගේ සහ ඔහුගේ හින්දු අධිපතිවාදී ಭಾರತೀಯ ජනතා පක්ෂයේ ඉලක්කය වෙන්නේ මේ අවස්ථාවේ ඉන්දියානු පාලක ප්‍රභුවේ බලගතු කොටස්වල දේශීය හා විදේශීය මහා ව්‍යාපාරිකයන්ගේ සංගත මාධ්‍යවල සහ ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම එක්සත් ජනපදයේ හා සෙසු අධිරාජ්‍යවාදී බලයන්ගේ ආශිර්වාදය සහිතව ඉන්දියාවේ දැන් පැවැත්වෙන මහමැතිවරණයෙන් තුන්වන වතාවටත් බලයට පත්වෙන එකයි. ඔවුන්ගේ අභිප්‍රාය වෙන්නේ ආයෝජන හිතති ආර්ථික ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ පිළිවෙත් රුදුරු ලෙස ඉදිරියට ගෙන යාම සහ ඒ වගේම එක්සත් ජනපදයේ සමග ඉන්දියාවට පවතින මේ මූලෝපායික හවුල්කාරීත්වය තවදුරටත් වර්ධනය කිරීමයි. ඒ විතරක් නෙවි මේ පිළිවෙත් වලට එරෙහිව අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම පැනනගින කම්පරුවන්ගේ තරුණයන්ගේ හා ගම්බද දුගී ජනයාගේ අරගල මුර්ග ලෙස තලා දැමීම පිණිස හින්දු සෝත්තම්පාදය මත පාදක වුණු පැසිස් පාලනයක් තහවුරු කිරීමයි. කොහොම වුණත් කොංග්‍රස් පක්ෂයේ නායකත්වය යටතේ පවතින ඒ වගේම විවිධාකාර ප්‍රාදේශීය ධනපති පක්ෂ සහ ඉන්දියානු මාක්ස්වාදී කොමියුනිස්ට් පක්ෂය නැතිනම් CPM හා ඉන්දියානු කොමියුනිස්ට් පක්ෂය CPI යන ස්ටැලින්වාදීනුත් ඇතුළත් ඉන්දියානු ජාතික සංවර්ධන පුළුල් සන්ධානය ලෙස හැඳින්වෙන ඉන්දියානමින් කෙටියෙන් හැඳින්වෙන ඒ විපාර්ශික පෙරමුණට මෝදිගේ ಭಾರತೀಯ ජනතා පක්ෂයෙන් අතිමූලිකව වෙනස් ආර්ථික හා විදේශ පිළිවෙත් ඇත්තේ නැහැ. මේ ඉන්දියා සන්ධානය ඒ ආර්ථික ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ පිළිවෙත් වලට සහ ඉන්දියාව එක්සත් ජනපද මූලෝපායික හවුල්කාරීත්වයට මුළුමනින්ම කැප වෙලා ඉන්නේ. ඒක නිසා මේ මහ මැතිවරණයේදී ඉන්දියානු කම්පරු පන්තියට තෝරගන්න කියලා පක්ෂයක් ඇත්තේ නැහැ. ඔවුන් ස්ටැලින්වාදීන්ද ඇතුළු ධනේශ්වර දේශපාලන සංස්ථාපිතයේ මේ සියලු පක්ෂ ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කළ යුතුයි. ඔවුන් සමාජවාදී පිළිවෙත් සඳහා කැපවුණු කම්පරු ආණ්ඩුවක් සඳහා වූ අරගලයේ ඇතුළේ ගම්බද දුගීන් රැලි කරගෙන ස්වාධීන දේශපාලන ව්‍යාපාරයක් හැටියට බලමුළු ගැන්වෙන්න ඕන. මෙය දකුණු ආසියාවේ හා ජාත්‍යන්තරව සමාජවාදය සඳහා වන පුළුල් අරගලයක කොටසක්. ඉන්දියාවෙන් හා එක්සත් ජනපදයෙන් එල්ලවෙන වැඩෙන පීඩනයට ප්‍රතිචාර දක්වමින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ජනාධිපති රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහගේ ආණ්ඩුව චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද ඉන්දියානු යුද ධාවනයට ශ්‍රී ලංකාව සමීපව ඒකාග්‍ර කරන්න වැඩ කරනවා. අප්‍රේල් මාසයේ අගදී එක්සත් ජනපද සහ ශ්‍රී ලංකා නාවික හමුදා නැගෙනහිර ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ත්‍රිකුණාමලයේ වෙරළට ඔබ්බෙන් සාගරයේ දිපාර්ශ්වික ඒකාබද්ධ යුදාභ්‍යාසත් පැවැත්තුවා. වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව පහුගිය ඔක්තෝබර් මාසයේ මුල ඉඳන්ම ගාසා තීරයේ ඊශ්‍රායලය ගෙන යන ජනසංහාරක යුද්ධයට සහයෝගය දෙනවා. මේ අවුරුද්දේ මුල ආණ්ඩුව එක්සත් ජනපදයේ නායකත්වයෙන් යුක්ත සන්ධානයට එකතු වීම සඳහා රතු මුහුදට නාවික හමුදා යාත්‍රාවක් යවුවා. ඒ සන්ධානය හදලා තියෙන්නේ යෙමනයේ ඉඳලා ක්‍රියාත්මක වන ඉරානයේ සහයෝගය ලබන හෝති කැරල්කරුවන් එල්ල කරන ප්‍රහාර වලින් රතු මුහුදේ ගමන් කරන වාණිජ නෞකා ආරක්ෂා කර ගැනීමටයි කියලා තමයි කියන්නේ. ඒ වගේම වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව 400කට අධික රාජ්‍ය සතු ව්‍යවසායම් ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගතකරණය එහෙම නැත්නම් පුජ්‍යලීකරණය කිරීම මගින් ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරුමුදල විසින් නියම කරන ලද ඒ රුදුරු කප්පාදු පිළිවෙත් උස්සන්න කරන්න කටයුතු කරනවා. මේ පියවර ලක්ෂ 5ක පමණ රැකියා විනාශ කිරීමට, වැටුප් හා සේවා කොන්දේසි කප්පාදු කිරීමට සහ විදුලිය හා ජලය වැනි සේවාවල මිල ගණන් ඉවසිය නොහැකි ඉහළ මට්ටම් වලට තවදුරටත් වැඩි කිරීමට හේතු වෙනව ඇති. කම්බරු පන්තිය තමන්ගේ සමාජ අයිතීන්ට එරෙහි වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුවේ මේ මුර්ග ප්‍රහාරයට විරුද්ධව අරගලවලට අවතීර්ණ වෙමින් සිටිනවා. මේ අවුරුද්දේ මුල ලංකා විදුලි බල මණ්ඩලයේ දසදහස් ගණන් කම්පරුවෝ ආණ්ඩුවේ පුජ්‍යලීකරණ සැලසුම් වලට විරුද්ධව දින 3ක වර්ජනයක් හා විරෝධතා පැවැත්තුවා. වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව රාජ්‍ය මර්ධනය උස්සන්න කරනවා. එහි එල්ලය වෙන්නේ කම්පරු පන්තියේ මෙම වැඩෙන අරගල තලා දැමීමයි. රාජ්‍ය අංශයේ ආයතන ගණනාවක කම්පරුවන්ගේ වර්ජන හා සෙසු පන්ති ක්‍රියා තහනම් කරන අත්‍යවශ්‍ය සේවා නියෝග, වර්ජන බිඳදාන්න මිලිටරි යෙදවීම සහ කාර්මික ක්‍රියාවන් වල යෙදීම නිසා කම්පරුවන්ගේ සේවය අත්හිටුවීම ඒ මර්ධනකාරී පියවරයන්ට ඇතුළත් වෙනවා. වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව කම්පරු පන්තියට එරෙහිව පන්ති යුද්ධය උස්සන්න කරන්නයි මේ ආකාරයට වැඩ කරන්නේ. සමග ජනබලවේගය සහ ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණ ඇතුළු ධනේශ්වර විපාර්ශික පක්ෂවලට ආර්ථික පිළිවෙත සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගත්තහම වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව සමග කිසිදු අතිමූලික මතභේදයක් ඇත්තේ නැහැ. ඔවුන් ඒ ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදලේ කප්පාදු වැඩපිළිවෙලට කැප වෙලා ඉන්නේ. අනාගතයේ පැවැත්වෙන මැතිවරණයකින් ඔවුන් බලයටපත් වුණොත් ඔවුන් මීට සමාන රුදුරු ආකාරයකින් එම පිළිවෙත්ම ඉදිරියට ගෙන යනවා ඇති. ඒ වගේම කම්පරුවන්ගේ, තරුණයන්ගේ හා ගම්බද දුගීන්ගේ විරුද්ධත්වය ම්ලේච්ඡ ආකාරයෙන් තලා දබනවා ඇති. වෘත්තීය සමිති, පෙරටුගාමී සමාජවාදී පක්ෂය වැනි ව්‍යාජ වාම සංවිධානවල සහයෝගය ඇතුව ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්නේ තමන්ගේ සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන්ට එරෙහි වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුවේ ප්‍රහාරවලට විරුද්ධව කම්පරු පන්තියේ ස්වාධීන දේශපාලන ව්‍යාපාරයක් වළක්වන පවුරක් හැටියටයි. එවක පැවති රාජපක්ෂ ආණ්ඩුව බලයෙන් පහ කරපු 2022 මහජන නැගිටීම ඇතුළතදී ඔවුන් කරෙත් හරියටම ඒ වැඩීමයි. 2022 මහජන නැගිටීම අත්දැකීමෙන් කම්පරු පන්තිය උකහා ගන්න ඕන තීරණාත්මක දේශපාලන පාඩම වෙන්නේ පාලක පන්තියේ ප්‍රහාරයට විරුද්ධව තමන්ගේ ජයග්‍රහණය සහතික කරගන්න නම් විප්ලවවාදී සමාජවාදී නායකත්වයක් හා ඉදිරි දර්ශනයක් අවශ්‍යයි කියන එකයි. මහජන නැගිටීම සමත් වුණා එවක හිටපු ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂට ඉල්ලා අස් වෙලා රටින් පලා යන්න බල කරන්න. ඒ වගේම ඔහුගේ ආණ්ඩුව කඩාවට්ටන්න. නමුත් පාලක ප්‍රභුවට යම් විශ්වාසයක් ගන්න පුළුවන් වුණා ජනාධිපති තනතුරට වික්‍රමසිංහ ඔසවලා තියලා. කම්පරු පන්තිය අර්බුදයට තමන්ගේම සමාජවාදී විසඳුම ක්‍රියාවට දාන්න අසමත් වුණේ විප්ලවවාදී නායකත්වයක් හා ඉදිරි දර්ශනයක් ඔවුන්ට නොතිබීම නිසායි. ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන්ට එරෙහි තමන්ගේ පුළුල් ප්‍රහාරවල කොටසක් හැටියට වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුව දැන් තීන්දුව කරලා තියෙනවා පිළිගත් දේශපාලන පක්ෂවල ජනාධිපති අපේක්ෂකයන්ගේ අපමුදල් රුපියල් මිලියන 2.6 දක්වා 52 ගුණයකින් වැඩි කරන්න. ඒ වගේම ස්වාධීන අපේක්ෂකයන් සඳහා මේ අපමුදල රුපියල් 75000 ඉඳලා රුපියල් මිලියන 3.1 දක්වා වැඩි කරනවා. අනිකුත් මැතිවරණ සඳහා අවශ්‍ය අපමුදල්ද කීප ගුණයකින් වැඩි කරනවා. මේ පියවරේ එල්ලේ වෙන්නේ පොදුවේ දේශපාලන විරුද්ධවාදීන්ද විශේෂයෙන්ම සමාජවාදී විපාර්ශ්වයයි. ඒ කියන්නේ සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය ඉවත් කිරීමයි. වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුවේ මේ මෑතම පියවර ඇතුළු කම්පරු පන්තියේ සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන්ට එරෙහි පාලක පන්තියේ ප්‍රහාරයට ප්‍රතිකාර වශයෙන් සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය අපේ පක්ෂයේ දේශපාලන හා න්‍යායික වැඩ කටයුතු වර්ධනය කිරීමේ හා පක්ෂයේම ගොඩනැගීමේ අභිලාෂකාමී වැඩපිළිවෙලක් දියත් කරලා තියෙනවා. රුපියල් මිලියන 3.5ක පක්ෂ සංවර්ධන අරමුදලක් මෙන්ම පක්ෂයට හා සමාජ සමානතාවය උදෙසා ජාත්‍යන්තර තරුණයෝ සහ ශිෂ්‍යෝ සංවිධානයට නව සමාජිකයන් බඳවා ගැනීමේ ව්‍යාපාරයක්. ලෝක සමාජවාදී වෙබ් අඩවියට අප ලියන ලිපි වර්ධනය කර ගැනීම සහ සිංහල හා දෙමළ භාෂාවන්ගෙන් මාක්ස්වාදී ට්‍රොස්කිවාදී සාහිත්‍ය පළ කර ගැනීම මෙම පියවරයන්ට ඇතුළත් වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම මහජන නැගිටීම තුල 2022 ජූලි මැද අපි දියත් කරපු කම්පරුවන්ගේ හා ගම්බද ජනතාවගේ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර හා සමාජවාදී සම්මේලනයක් ගොඩනැගීමේ අපගේ උද්ඝෝෂණය අපි අකණ්ඩව ඉදිරියට ගෙනියනවා. අපි කම්පරුවන්ගෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටිනෝ සෑම වැඩපොලකම, කම්හලකම, වතුකරේ හා නිවහම් ප්‍රදේශවල සමිති නිලධරයන්ගෙන් හා සියලු ධනපති පක්ෂවලින් ස්වාධීනව තමන්ගේම ක්‍රියාකාරී කමිටු ගොඩනගන්න කියලා. ගම්බද දුගීනුත් ඔවුන්ගේ ප්‍රදේශවල ඒ ආකාරයේ කමිටු ගොඩනගිය යුතුයි. ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර හා සමාජවාදී සම්මේලනය පාදක වෙනව ඇත්තේ එවන් ක්‍රියාකාරී කමිටු වලින් ප්‍රජාතාන්ත්‍රිකව තෝරා පත් කරගන්න නියෝජිතයන් මතයි. ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී හා සමාජවාදී සම්මේලනය ගොඩනැගීම හරහා සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය ජාත්‍යන්තර සමාජවාදය මත පාදක වුණු ගම්බද දුගීන් හා තරුණයන් රැලි කරගත්තු දේශපාලන ව්‍යාපාරයක් තුළ කම්පරු පන්තිය ස්වාධීනව බලමුළු ගැන්වීමේ අපගේ අරගලය වර්ධනය කරනවා. එවන් ව්‍යාපාරයක එල්ලය වෙන්නේ ධනේශ්වරය පාලනය පෙරලා දාලා කම්පරි ගොවි ආණ්ඩුවක් බලයට ගෙන ඒමයි. ඒක සමාජවාදී ජාත්‍යන්ත්‍රවාදය සඳහා වන වඩා පුළුල් අරගලයක කොටසක්. එහිදී සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය හතරවන ජාත්‍යන්තරයේ ජාත්‍යන්තර කමිටුවේ අපගේ සහෝදර පක්ෂ සමග සමීප සහයෝගයකින් කටයුතු කරනවා. මම මේ අවස්ථාවේ කම්පරුවන්ගෙන් තරුණයන්ගෙන් ගම්බද දුගීකින් හා සමාජවාදී හිතති බුද්ධිමතුන්ගෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටින්නේ සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය සමග එකතු වෙන ලෙසයි. එමගින් මෙම තීරණාත්මක දේශපාලන අරගලය ඉදිරියට ගෙන යන්න අපිත් එක්ව එක් වෙන ලෙසයි. ඔබට බොහොම ස්තුතියි.
Realizamos este evento de 1º de maio em um ponto de inflexão da crise política mundial. A burguesia imperialista mergulhou inteiramente no turbilhão da guerra e arrasta consigo o mundo inteiro para a catástrofe. Os desenvolvimentos da guerra mundial repercutem imediatamente e de forma explosiva na América Latina. 2 anos atrás, no ato de 1º de maio de 2022 do Comitê Internacional, que se dedicou a formular uma estratégia de luta contra a guerra imperialista, nós declaramos: uma nova guerra mundial colocará necessariamente a América Latina no mapa do conflito, em uma escala incomparável com as 2 guerras anteriores. Essa previsão atingiu um grau de concretude imenso. Os contornos do mapa da guerra na América Latina já estão sendo traçados. Uma série de acontecimentos no último mês marcaram um salto qualitativo na ofensiva dos Estados Unidos contra a China, Rússia e Irã dentro do território sul-americano. Essa escalada militarista foi anunciada pela general Laura Richardson, chefe do Comando Sul dos Estados Unidos, em um discurso inflamatório no Congresso americano no último mês de março. Richardson alardeou que a Rússia, e particularmente a China, está se apoderando da abundância de alimentos, água e minerais terrestres essenciais presentes na América Latina. Deixou claro que isso representa um desafio intolerável para Washington. Para o imperialismo americano, os recursos estratégicos na região, historicamente vista como quintal dos Estados Unidos, são seus por direito. A luta por esses interesses vitais do capitalismo americano em decomposição é justificada por uma propaganda histérica crescente contra a chamada agenda maligna dos competidores estratégicos de Washington. Operações pacíficas, como a construção de um porto comercial no Peru pela China, são fraudulentamente apresentadas como manobras militares disfarçadas. No início de abril, Richardson fez uma viagem crucial para Ushuaia, no sul da Argentina, onde o presidente fascista argentino, Javier Milei, anunciou a construção de uma base naval conjunta com os Estados Unidos. O ponto geográfico no Atlântico Sul é considerado como um ponto de estrangulamento global estratégico. Ao lado do Canal do Panamá, é uma rota necessária para o transporte de toneladas de mercadorias da América do Sul para a Ásia. Ao mesmo tempo, a Marinha da Argentina inaugurou um programa de patrulhamento conjunto com a Guarda Costeira Americana dos mares argentinos, ostensivamente voltado contra a presença de navios de pesca chineses clandestinos, que supostamente ameaçam a segurança regional. Washington enviou o destroyer USCGC James para este fim, que pode levar a confrontos diretos das Forças Armadas Americanas com embarcações civis chinesas. O giro abrupto da política externa argentina para Washington e os seus objetivos de guerra não é meramente uma escolha política do regime fascistoide de Milei. Ela se baseia em relações objetivas essenciais entre os capitalismos nacionais latino-americanos e o imperialismo. No Brasil, governado por Lula do Partido dos Trabalhadores, supostamente de esquerda, os militares ecoam crescentemente uma retórica belicosa e pró-imperialista. Com o apoio do governo Lula, as Forças Armadas têm bombardeado a população brasileira com uma campanha para decuplicar o orçamento militar do país. Similar às acusações do governo Milei, o comandante da Marinha Brasileira fez repetidos alertas públicos sobre, abre aspas, a presença de potências extra-regionais no entorno estratégico brasileiro, fecha aspas, referindo-se a navios chineses. E sobre a necessidade de, abre aspas, construir uma mentalidade de defesa, fecha aspas, na população brasileira, ou seja, prepará-la para a guerra. Nesse contexto, horas após a visita de Richardson à Argentina, em 4 de abril, os Estados Unidos anunciaram o deslocamento do porta-aviões nuclear USS George Washington para exercícios militares com países da América do Sul. Militares da Argentina, Brasil, Chile, Colômbia, Paraguai, Equador e Peru, e de países da OTAN, receberão lições a bordo de professores da Academia de Guerra dos Estados Unidos. Simbolicamente, o porta-aviões vai ancorar no Brasil, no Peru e no Chile. Este último, assim como a Argentina, compõe o chamado Triângulo do Lítio, uma região que abriga 60% das reservas conhecidas do mineral crucial para a produção de veículos elétricos e armamentos de guerra de última geração. A terceira ponta do triângulo, a Bolívia, que tem as maiores reservas de lítio do planeta, está fora dos exercícios. O país governado por Luiz Arce, do Movimento ao Socialismo, fechou contratos com consórcios chineses e russos para impulsionar a exploração do mineral estratégico dentro do próximo período. Movimentações geopolíticas explosivas estão em rápido desenvolvimento nesses locais. A iminência de confrontos militares diretos na região veio à tona recentemente com a reivindicação da região rica em petróleo de Essequibo, hoje pertencente à Guiana, pela Venezuela de Nicolás Maduro. O regime nacionalista burguês do chavista Maduro, que se apoia nas imensas reservas de petróleo em seu país, possui relações comerciais e militares estratégicas com a China, Rússia e Irã, que utiliza para contrabalancear o peso das pressões imperialistas. A conclamação de Essequibo por Maduro provocou uma resposta ofensiva unificada das potências imperialistas. Reafirmando as bases de sua velha política colonialista, o Reino Unido enviou navios de guerra para a região a fim de coibir Maduro. E agindo como um mediador regional do imperialismo, papel que desempenha cada vez mais abertamente, o governo Lula enviou forças militares massivas para as fronteiras com a Venezuela. A divisão histórica das fronteiras da Venezuela e Guiana se baseou em tratados supervisionados pelo imperialismo por sua própria natureza injustos. Outras dezenas de fronteiras pela América Latina foram definidas de forma semelhante e podem emergir como novos focos de guerras regionais. Mas a redivisão desses territórios por regimes nacionalistas burgueses como o de Maduro, semelhante à invasão da Ucrânia por Putin, é incapaz de assumir um mínimo caráter democrático ou progressista. Os problemas que confrontam a humanidade A desigualdade social, a erupção da guerra, pandemias e catástrofes naturais residem diretamente no fato de que a divisão do mundo em estados nacionais é incompatível com o caráter globalmente integrado da economia e da vida social no século XXI. Quando ascenderam ao poder no início do século, Lula, Chávez e os demais governos da chamada Maré Rosa defenderam a possibilidade do desenvolvimento econômico e social da região através de uma união latino-americana burguesa, em harmonia com o imperialismo. Essas ilusões reacionárias caíram por terra definitivamente. Junto com elas, se expõem as ilusões em uma nova ordem multipolar, suplantando o imperialismo americano em crise. Lula, eleito pela pseudo-esquerda internacional como um protagonista central dessa perspectiva política, é um paradigma do caráter reacionário do chamado multipolarismo. Enquanto ele condena hipocritamente o genocídio em Gaza, Lula busca desesperadamente o apoio das potências imperialistas, promovendo como os paladinos da democracia e da paz figuras como Joe, o genocida Biden, e Emmanuel Macron, que defende enviar tropas da OTAN para a Ucrânia. Nos países imperialistas e nos países atrasados, não existe nenhuma alternativa possível para a classe trabalhadora no interior do Estado Nacional burguês e nos seus sistemas políticos. Sob a crise do capitalismo e a guerra, a classe dominante na América Latina, dos partidos e camarilhas militares fascistas que emergem ao centro da política em todos os seus países, até os velhos representantes da esquerda oficial, todos avançam unificados contra a classe trabalhadora. A experiência universal das massas latino-americanas é o crescente empobrecimento e a destruição de empregos, o desmantelamento das estruturas sociais mais básicas, que vem provocando epidemias devastadoras de doenças como a dengue, assim como do analfabetismo. Mas, se a superfície da vida política, dominada pela burguesia, é de crescente reação, mais embaixo, a classe trabalhadora evolui politicamente para a esquerda, em direção à Revolução Socialista. Esse é o caso mesmo naqueles países em que governos de extrema-direita foram recentemente eleitos. A eleição de Milei na Argentina, resultado da profunda desmoralização do peronismo após anos de ajustes capitalistas, acompanha um movimento explosivo de greves e protestos de juventude que continuam sem cessar. A questão política fundamental colocada é a da direção política. Em nenhum país é possível dar um passo político para frente sem a mobilização da classe trabalhadora, com base numa estratégia e prática diretamente internacionalista. No Brasil, em todos os países da América Latina, convocamos os jovens e trabalhadores a construir um Partido Socialista pela Igualdade, baseado no programa e na direção internacional do Comitê Internacional da Quarta Internacional. Não há tempo a perder.
Revolutionary greetings on this year's May Day. To celebrate this holiday of the international working class, Mehring Books, the publishing arm of the World Socialist website and the International Committee of the Fourth International, is offering a 20% discount on all of our titles. Everyone serious about revolutionary politics must be committed to reading, studying, and learning a great deal. The struggle for socialism requires an assimilation of the lessons of history, the history of the revolutionary workers' movement, of the Fourth International, and the events of the 20th and 21st centuries, above all, the experiences of the October 1917 Russian Revolution. Mehring Books offers the core works of classical Marxism, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg. We also feature the works of leading members of the ICFI, including the writings of David North, the WSWS chairman of the International Editorial Board. These include the newly published Logic of Zionism, From Nationalist Myth to the Gaza Genocide. This critical work brings together lectures given by David North late last year as mass opposition to the US-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza erupted in worldwide protests. The lectures offer a penetrating analysis of the reactionary ideological and political foundations of Zionism and make a powerful call to international action by the working class in defense of the Palestinian people. Also newer to the Mehring catalog is Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. Again and again, the events of the last 100 years have vindicated Trotsky's struggle for the perspective of world socialist revolution. This work, a collection of essays written by North over a period spanning 40 years, elaborates the key theoretical and political contributions made by Trotsky to the development of Marxism and the burning relevance of his work today. Both of these books are available in print and EPUB editions. Other works by David North available from Mehring Books include The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, a systematic examination of the central historical and theoretical questions of the 20th century. This work explains why the same problems of that century, devastating wars, economic crises, social inequality, and the threat of dictatorship and fascism, confront us more sharply today than ever before. The Heritage We Defend, the definitive history of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement. A Quarter Century of War. This book provides a critical examination of the past 30 years of unending imperialist war waged by Washington, which set the stage for the global crisis and war now unfolding. The Frankfurt School, Postmodernism, and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, a Marxist critique. Examining the complex interaction between history, philosophy, and politics, these essays defend historical materialism against contemporary anti-Marxist philosophical tendencies related to the Frankfurt School and postmodernism. The New York Times' 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History. This is the only comprehensive left-wing critique of the 1619 Project, featuring essays and interviews with prominent scholars of American history and writers for the World Socialist website. Mehring also publishes the works of Vadim Rogovin, Russian historian and sociologist of inequality in the USSR. His series, Was There an Alternative?, is an unparalleled examination of the struggle of the Trotskyist left opposition against Stalinism. We also publish the writings of Alexander Vronsky, a left oppositionist, participant in the October Revolution, and leading literary critic, whose materialist approach to questions of art and society represented an enormous step forward for the field of aesthetics, and whose works speak to the crisis of artistic perspective today. You can find all of these works at Mehring.com in North America and at the URLs below worldwide. Take advantage of our 20% discount in celebration of May Day through May 6th this year by going to Mehring.com and using the code MAYDAY2024. Purchase any volume from Mehring for 20% off through May 6th using MAYDAY2024. Thank you.
There are incidents that subtly reveal fundamental truths about a complex social phenomenon hitherto cloaked in ruling class mystification and lies. Such an incident occurred last September 22nd, when Canada's Parliament and assembled dignitaries, including Ukrainian President Zelensky and the diplomatic representatives of Canada's G7 allies, rose in unison to give a standing ovation to the 98-year-old Ukrainian Waffen-SS veteran Yaroslav Hunka. Faced with an international outcry, Canada's trade union-backed Liberal government and the opposition parties subsequently claimed their celebration of the Nazi Hunka as a Ukrainian and Canadian hero was an unfortunate mistake. What a contemptible fraud. The mobilization of the political descendants of the Ukrainian fascists who collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust and their war of annihilation against the Soviet Union has been pivotal to the Western imperialist powers' drive to encircle and subjugate Russia. The Ukrainian far right spearheaded the February 2014 coup that Washington and Berlin orchestrated with Ottawa's support to overthrow the country's democratically elected pro-Russian president. Now, fully integrated into the Ukrainian military with the assistance of Canadian Armed Forces trainers, the Azov Battalion and other fascist militia are Ukraine's shock troops in NATO's war with Russia. Partisans of the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera and his fascist organization of Ukrainian nationalists staff senior positions in the Zelensky regime and its military security apparatus. They are Washington and Ottawa's staunchest supporters in waging war with Russia to the last Ukrainian. The NATO powers' promotion of the Ukrainian fascists arises from the predatory aims and interests they are pursuing through their war with Russia. As they did in the two world wars of the last century, the imperialist powers are waging war to seize resources, markets, and strategic territories, are trying, vampire-like, to infuse themselves with new energy through an orgy of death and destruction. The Canadian Parliament's honoring of the Nazi war criminal Hunka also speaks to the outsized role that Canadian imperialism has played in politically and ideologically preparing, instigating, and prosecuting the US-NATO war with Russia. As the World Socialist website has extensively documented, Canadian imperialism has a more than 3/4 of a century-long alliance with the Ukrainian far right. At the end of the Second World War, Canada provided refuge to tens of thousands of Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, Waffen SS veterans like Hunka, as well as supporters of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its Ukrainian insurgent army. To further Canada's Cold War foreign policy against the Soviet Union and combat powerful left-wing sympathies among the country's extensive Ukrainian immigrant population, Ottawa assisted the Ukrainian fascists in whitewashing their crimes and in propagating a virulent, anti-Bolshevik and anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. To use the words of the best-known Canadian-Ukrainian historian, the government founded and funded Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, but the glorification of the fascist Bandera and his supporters at the very center of the Ukrainian national identity project. Among those involved in the export of this far-right Western imperialist-aligned nationalism back to Ukraine following the Stalinist bureaucracy's dissolution of the USSR was Chrystia Freeland. Freeland, herself the granddaughter of a leading Ukrainian Nazi collaborator, is today Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and the leading Ukraine war hawk in the Trudeau Liberal government. The events of the past 7 months have provided horrific confirmation of what was revealed in microcosm in the Hunka affair about the predatory nature and violent, barbaric trajectory of Canadian and world imperialism. The Canadian ruling class stands four square behind Israel's genocidal assault on the Palestinians of Gaza, the mass slaughter of civilians by 2,000-pound bombs, the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, the leveling of entire neighborhoods, the starvation of Gaza's entire population, all are justified in the name of Israel's so-called right to defend itself. Meanwhile, Ottawa integrates itself ever more fully into US imperialism's global war against Russia and China and for unbridled domination over the Middle East. Earlier this month, the Trudeau government tabled a defense policy update that announced tens of billions in additional military spending over the next decade. Canada, it asserted, must have the military capabilities to wage war on every continent and ocean so as to uphold global stability and the Western-imposed international order. The same political establishment that celebrated the Nazi SS veteran Hunka and views the Ukrainian fascists as valuable allies smears the ongoing mass protests against the genocide in Gaza and against Canada's complicity in the slaughter as anti-Semitic. With increasing brazenness, it is moving to criminalize and repress them. This is a continuation of their earlier efforts to disrupt and prevent all meetings opposing the US-NATO-instigated Ukraine war. Last June, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality and the Socialist Equality Party held the first public meeting against the Ukraine war in Canada's most populous city, Toronto, defying a concerted campaign led by Ontario's Labour Minister and the government-backed far-right Ukrainian-Canadian Congress to censor it. The greatest fear of the Canadian ruling class, like its imperialist partners and rivals, is that the growing upsurge of the working class will be infused with a genuine anti-war, that is, a socialist internationalist perspective. Workers from every sector of the economy, including more than 500,000 Quebec public sector workers, West Coast dockers, supermarket workers, federal government employees, and national steel car workers have walked off the job over the past 12 months to impose government-backed, inflation-driven real wage cuts and reverse decades of concessions. Last year alone, there were more strikes than in the preceding 6 years combined. This movement, as attested by the numerous rejected union-endorsed tentative agreements and the increasingly prominent role played by rank-and-file committees affiliated with the International Workers' Alliance of rank-and-file committees, is developing and can only develop as a rebellion against the corporatist trade unions and for the independent political mobilization of the working class in the fight for workers' power. The role of the state-supported trade union apparatuses in systematically suppressing the class struggle is epitomized by the Union NDP Liberal Governmental Alliance in their propping up the Trudeau government as it wages a two-front war, providing billions in weapons to Ukraine and backing the genocide in Gaza, while increasing worker exploitation at home through austerity and wage cutting. As the war clouds gathered in 1934, Trotsky counseled that our task is to follow the map of the class struggle, not the war map. 6 years later, at the outset of the Second World War, a war made inevitable by the Stalinist bureaucracy's strangling of the working class's revolutionary strivings in Spain, France, and elsewhere, he declared, "The Revolutionary Party builds its entire policy upon the class consciousness of the workers. The Comintern is preoccupied with nothing but contaminating and poisoning this class consciousness." As crisis-ridden global capitalism hurls humanity towards the abyss, it is impelling workers and young people around the world to resist. If it is to prevail, this resistance must be leavened by an understanding that the objective logic of workers' opposition to war, reaction, and social inequality is world socialist revolution. And it must be armed with a revolutionary leadership and strategy grounded in the lessons of history. There is no better way to mark May Day 24 than to take up this task by joining the International Committee of the Fourth International. Thank you.
In Australia, as internationally, Israel's genocide in Gaza has produced major shock and opposition. Every week for the past 6 months, substantial protests have been held opposing the onslaught and the support it has received from the imperialist powers, including Australia. This is the most sustained anti-war movement in the country's history, but it has reached an impasse, a roadblock. The pseudo-left groups that lead the protests, as well as the Greens, insist that the task is to pressure the Labor government to change course. But this perspective has been tried and has failed. The Labour administration is one of the most aggressive defenders of Israel. No matter what atrocity the Zionist state perpetrates, whether it is the destruction of hospitals, the bombing of civilian areas, or cold-blooded executions, Labour declares Israel has a right to defend itself. At the same time, it has overseen a major crackdown on the right to protest as well as other civil liberties, and has aided a Zionist witch hunt against actors, artists, health workers, and others, slandering opposition to genocide as anti-Semitism. But this is based on a fraud, falsely identifying Jewish people with an imperialist-backed garrison state. It has been exposed in practice by the growing participation of Jewish people in the anti-genocide protests. The pseudo-left and the Greens are trying to cover up what is revealed by this complicity. Labour's position on the genocide is not an accident or an aberration. Labour is a pro-war party of imperialism committed to criminal US-led wars everywhere. In 1948, the Australian government was one of the first in the world to recognise Israel, established through the brutal dispossession of the Palestinians. Labour has supported every single action of the Zionist state since. Labour's support for the genocide today is inseparable from its role as a key partner of American imperialism's global war drive. That includes providing more than $1 billion to support the US-NATO proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. But even more significantly, Labour is completing Australia's transformation into a staging post for US-led war against China in this region. The other line of the middle-class fake left and the protest leaders is that the movement against genocide must orientate to the union leadership. But the unions have taken no action whatsoever and are a key ally of the Labour government. To cover over their role in suppressing opposition, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the peak union body, issued a statement last week calling for the government to halt arms shipments to Israel and impose sanctions. That such a statement was released expresses widespread sentiment amongst workers that actions must be taken. But the ACTU does nothing more than issue feckless appeals to the government. In fact, it is the unions themselves that are facilitating shipments to Israel. That includes the Maritime Union of Australia, held up as a left and progressive union. Every week, it ensures the orderly coming and going of cargo from the Israeli Zim shipping line, which, in October, dedicated its entire international fleet to the war effort. The MUA sometimes voices hollow statements of concern over the Palestinians, but in February, it invited Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to address its national conference, even though he is a party to the genocide. War abroad means war against the working class. The old depictions of Australia as a lucky country, exempt from social hardship and tension, have given way to the reality of brutal capitalist austerity. Military spending is more than $50 billion a year as part of the war drive, especially against China. Last week, Labour announced another $50 billion over the decade, which will take the annual defence expenditure to over $100 billion by 2034. Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS deal will cost at least $368 billion. There are limitless funds for militarism and war, but no money for the needs of ordinary people. In 2022, Labour came to office making phony promises that it would deliver a better future. But in power, Labour has insisted that ordinary people make sacrifices. Together with the unions, it has imposed the biggest real cuts to workers' living conditions in decades. Over the 3 years to December, wages have fallen by an average of 5.1% compared to inflation. Having a secure place to live is almost a luxury. Average weekly mortgage repayments have increased by $400 since May 2022, more than 8 times the increase in average wages. As a result, the number of Australians at risk of mortgage stress has doubled in less than 2 years. Almost 1/3 of owner-occupied mortgage holders are now in this category, the highest level since 2008. Advertised apartment rents have soared to record highs across the country, increasing by an average of 12.7% in the past 12 months. And of the 45,000 listed rental properties nationally, less than 300 are affordable to a full-time worker on the minimum wage. Public health care and education are in a state of complete breakdown, with understaffing, overcrowding, and no ability to meet demand. They are slated for even further cutbacks. In addition to the military, this money is going to the ultra-wealthy. Since 2020, 42 new Australian billionaires have been minted, bringing the total to 159. The combined wealth of Australia's 250 richest individuals has increased to $591 billion, a 57% rise in 4 years. There is mass opposition to Labor and the entire political establishment and a growing anti-capitalist sentiment. But to go forward, this developing movement must be based on an understanding that the source of all the problems we confront is the outmoded profit system. Labor and its counterparts around the world have exposed themselves as the right-wing and rotten parties of big business. The issue is that the working class needs its own party, based on a socialist and internationalist program to end war, inequality, and their source, the capitalist system. I appeal to you to join the SEP and the ICFI to fight for this perspective.
On behalf of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, I extend revolutionary greetings to workers and young people throughout the Pacific region who are facing increasingly imminent dangers as a result of the warmongering by US imperialism and its regional allies Australia and New Zealand. Impoverished countries such as Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, which saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the Second World War, are now being drawn into plans for a catastrophic war with China. No island is too small to avoid the militarization of the Pacific. The recent agreement between Australia and Tuvalu, which has just over 11,000 people, has effectively turned this tiny country into a colony, giving Canberra the power to dictate defence, security and foreign policy. Governments that try to maintain security ties with China and fail to bow to US dictates face the threat of violent regime change. This was the message sent to the Solomon Islands government, which experienced a US-backed coup attempt in 2021. New Zealand, as a member of the Five Eyes spy network and an imperialist power in the Pacific, is fully integrated into US war plans. Last August, the then Labour government Defence Minister, Andrew Little, openly declared that military spending had to double so that the armed forces were equipped and prepared to play a role should war break out in the South China Sea. The Labour-led government, which included the Green Party, also sent troops to Britain to assist in training Ukrainian conscripts to fight in the US-NATO war against Russia. Labour suffered a devastating defeat in last October's election after 6 years in which it oversaw increased poverty, inequality and homelessness, and a closer alliance with the United States. Jacinda Ardern resigned as Prime Minister in the lead-up to the election, followed by several of her ministers, like rats leaving a sinking ship. And in its final days, the Labour government endorsed Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, calling it an act of self-defence. The current deeply unpopular government, a coalition of the National Party and the far-right ACT and New Zealand First parties, is picking up where Labour left off. It has sent troops to assist in the bombing of Yemen, to defend supply routes for the Zionist regime. It intends to bring New Zealand into the anti-China AUKUS alliance, and it recently established military ties with the authoritarian Marcos regime in the Philippines, which plays a major role in US war plans. The Labour Party does not fundamentally disagree with any of this. Speaking for the entire ruling class, a prominent New Zealand Herald columnist recently wrote that, quote, full-scale war in Europe and Asia is now a real possibility, unquote, and for New Zealand to remain, quote, part of the Western defence network, that comes with a price, first in money and treasure, and perhaps later in blood, end quote. In the working class, however, there is widespread anti-war sentiment. Tens of thousands continue to join protests against the genocide in Gaza. When the organisers invited Labour MPs to speak at these demonstrations, these pro-imperialist politicians have been booed and shouted down. A recent survey found 68% of New Zealand residents oppose increased military spending, and nearly 2/3 agree that, quote, the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful, end quote. To fund the expansion of the military and cut taxes for the rich, the government is imposing brutal austerity measures. Thousands of public sector jobs have been destroyed, including in education, child welfare, and at the Ministry of Health. And 30,000 people across the country could lose their jobs in the next year. School lunches and disability services are being cut. Public hospitals, already grossly understaffed, are being forced to make further cuts. Meanwhile, dozens of people continue to die every month from COVID-19 due to the murderous policy of mass infection imposed by the Labour government in late 2021. The Socialist Equality Group stands alone in warning that none of the capitalist parties represents a progressive alternative. The only way forward is to build a socialist movement that unites working people in New Zealand and internationally to stop World War III by abolishing its root cause, the capitalist system. This requires a political struggle against middle-class pseudo-left groups like the International Socialist Organization, which fraudulently pose as socialists while doing everything they can to prevent the movement against austerity and war from getting out of the straitjacket of Parliament and the union bureaucracy. The ISO campaigned in the election for Labour and its allies the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. It calls on these capitalist parties, with their record of imposing savage cuts to essential services, to lead protests against austerity, along with the unions. It glorifies the unions for issuing press statements calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. This covers up the role of these corporatist organisations, which are an industrial police force for the ruling class. They enforce attacks on jobs and living standards, and are preventing any action from workers to stop the production and supply of weapons for Israel and the United States. Like their counterparts in other countries, the pseudo-left in this country represents an upper-middle-class layer, including union officials, whose privileges depend on New Zealand being part of the imperialist alliance that is seeking to carve up the world. That is why the ISO has cheered NATO's aggressive war in Ukraine and glorified the extreme right-wing regime in Kiev. The pseudo-lefts promote the absurd lie that the same imperialist powers supporting genocide in Gaza are defending freedom and democracy against Russia. We call on workers listening in New Zealand and throughout this region to take up the fight for a genuine socialist anti-war movement. This will require new organisations, rank-and-file committees, independent of the trade unions, to mobilise the working class to stop this developing Third World War. Most importantly, I urge you to contact the Socialist Equality Group and join our fight to build the New Zealand section of the International Committee of the Fourth International.
தோழர்களே, 4ஆம் அகிலத்தின் அனைத்துலக குழுவில் உள்ள நமது தோழர்களின் நெருக்கமான ஒத்துழைப்புடன் சமூக சமத்துவத்திற்கான அனைத்துலக இளைஞர் மற்றும் மாணவர் அமைப்பானது தொழிலாளர்களிடம் இளைஞர்களிடம் சர்வதேச பகுஜன எதிர்ப்பு இயக்கத்தை கட்டியெழுப்ப போராடி வருகின்றது. இந்த இயக்கமானது ஏகாதிபத்திய போரையும் பேரழிவுமிக்க அணுவாயுத 3ஆம் உலகப் போரையும் நிறுத்தும் வல்லமை கொண்ட ஒரே ஒரு சமூக சக்தியான சர்வதேச தொழிலாளர் வர்க்கத்தை அடிப்படையாக கொண்டிருக்க வேண்டும். அதே நேரம் அது சர்வதேச சோசியலிச கொள்கைகளால் வழிநடத்தப்பட வேண்டும். எமது பிரச்சாரம் காசாவில் இஸ்ரேல் மேற்கொள்ளும் இனப்படுகொலை, உக்ரைனில் ரஷ்யாவுக்கு எதிராக அமெரிக்க நேட்டோவின் போர், அத்தோடு சீனாவுக்கு எதிரான அமெரிக்க போர் தயாரிப்புகளை நிறுத்துவதை நோக்கமாக கொண்டுள்ளது. காசா இனப்படுகொலைக்கு எதிராக அமெரிக்கா முழுவதிலும் உள்ள பல்கலைக்கழகங்களில் நடைபெறும் மாணவர் போராட்டங்கள் மீது பைடன் அரசாங்கத்தால் கட்டவிழ்க்கப்பட்டுள்ள கொடூரமான போலீஸ் அடக்குமுறையை நாம் கடுமையாக கண்டிக்கின்றோம். இந்த இனப்படுகொலைக்கு எதிராக போராடும் அனைவரையும் பாதுகாக்க அமெரிக்காவிலும் உலகம் முழுவதிலும் உள்ள தொழிலாளர்களை அணிதிரளுமாறு அழைப்பு விடுக்கின்றோம். ஏகாதிபத்திய போருக்கு எதிராக இளைஞர்களையும் மாணவர்களையும் அணிதிரட்டுவதற்கான எமது போராட்டத்தில் அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம், யாழ்ப்பாண பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் உட்பட பல்வேறு மாணவர் அமைப்புகளின் அரசியல் செல்வாக்கை எதிர்த்து IYSSC போராடுகின்றது. அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியமும் யாழ்ப்பாண பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியமும் அடிப்படை உரிமைகளை பாதுகாப்பதற்கான அவர்களின் போராட்டத்தில் மாணவர்கள் தொழிலாளர்கள் பக்கம் திரும்புவதை தடுப்பதற்கும் மாணவர்களை பிற்போக்கு அரசியல் முதலாளித்துவ அரசியல் கட்டமைப்புக்குள் அடைத்து வைப்பதற்கும் செயற்படுகின்றன. போலி இடது முன்னிலை சோசியலிச கட்சியால் கட்டுப்படுத்தப்படும் அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியமானது காசா இனப்படுகொலை மற்றும் ஏகாதிபத்திய போரின் வளர்ந்து வரும் ஆபத்துக்கள் பற்றி மாணவர்களை இருட்டிலேயே வைத்திருக்கின்றது. அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர்கள் மத்தியில் IYSSCயின் பிரச்சாரங்களை நிறுத்த வன்முறையோடு தலையீடு செய்கின்றது. ஜனாதிபதி ரணில் விக்ரமசிங்க அரசாங்கத்தால் இலவச கல்வி மீது மேற்கொள்ளப்படும் தாக்குதலுக்கு எதிராக மாணவர்களின் கோபம் அதிகரித்து வருகையில் அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் மாணவர்களின் கோபத்தை கட்டுப்படுத்த பயனற்ற போராட்டங்களை ஏற்பாடு செய்து வருவதோடு அத்தகைய நடவடிக்கைகள் அரசாங்கத்தை பின்வாங்க நிர்பந்திக்கும் என்ற மாயையை பரப்பி அரசாங்கத்தின் மீது அழுத்தம் கொடுக்கும் போராட்டங்களாக அதை மட்டுப்படுத்துகின்றது. அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் கூறுவதற்கு மாறாக இலவச கல்வி மீது விக்ரமசிங்க அரசாங்கத்தின் தாக்குதல்கள் சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியம் வழங்கிய $3 பில்லியன் பிணையெடுப்பு கடனுக்கு ஈடாக அதனால் கட்டளையிடப்பட்டுள்ள கடுமையான சிக்கன நடவடிக்கைகளின் ஒரு பாகமாகும். விக்ரமசிங்க அரசாங்கமோ அல்லது எதிர்கால தேர்தல்களை தொடர்ந்து வரும் வேறு எந்த அரசாங்கமோ IMF வேலை திட்டத்திலிருந்து விலகி இருக்க முடியாது. தொழிலாளர் வர்க்கத்தை நோக்கி திரும்புவதற்கும் அரசாங்கத்துக்கு எதிராகவும் சோசலிச கொள்கைகளுக்காகவும் மாணவர்களை அணிதிரட்டி தொழிலாளர்கள் தலைமையிலான ஒன்றிணைந்த அரசியல் இயக்கத்தை கட்டியெழுப்ப மாணவர்கள் மத்தியில் IYSSC முன்னெடுக்கும் அரசியல் போராட்டத்துக்கு அனைத்து பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் முற்றிலுமே விரோதமாக நிற்கின்றது. அத்தகைய தொழிலாளர் வர்க்க இயக்கத்தால் முதலாளித்துவ ஆட்சியை தூக்கி வீசி ஸ்தாபிக்கப்படுகின்ற சோசியலிச கொள்கைகளுக்காக அர்ப்பணித்துக் கொண்ட தொழிலாளர் விவசாய அரசாங்கத்தின் ஊடாக மாத்திரமே இலவச கல்வியை பாதுகாக்க முடியும். யாழ்ப்பாண பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியமும் காசா இனப்படுகொலை மீது மௌனம் காக்கின்றது. உலக சோசியலிச வலைத்தளத்துக்கு பதிலளித்த அதன் தலைவர் துவார்கன், நாம் சர்வதேச அபிவிருத்திகள் பற்றி கவலைப்படுவதில்லை, நாம் எமது பிரச்சனைகள் பற்றி, அதாவது தமிழ் மக்களுடைய பிரச்சனைகளை பற்றியே நாம் அக்கறையாக உள்ளோம் என்றார். காசாவில் இஸ்ரேல் மேற்கொள்ளும் இனப்படுகொலை சம்பந்தமாக யாழ்ப்பாண பல்கலைக்கழக மாணவர் ஒன்றியம் மௌனம் காப்பது பிற்போக்கு தமிழ் தேசியவாதத்தின் அடிப்படையில் ஆகும். அதே நேரம் அது நெருக்கமாக உறவு வைத்துள்ள தமிழ் தேசிய கூட்டமைப்பு உட்பட தமிழ் முதலாளித்துவ தேசியவாத கட்சிகளின் ஏகாதிபத்திய சார்பு அரசியலில் இருந்தே இந்த மௌனம் தலை தூக்குகின்றது. இந்த கட்சிகள் சீனாவுக்கு எதிரான அமெரிக்க, இந்திய மற்றும் இந்திய இராணுவ மூலோபாய தாக்குதலுடன் முழுமையாக அணி சேர்ந்து நிற்கின்றன. அத்தோடு தமிழ் உயரடுக்குக்கு சில சலுகைகளை உறுதிப்படுத்தும் அதிகார பகிர்வு உடன்படிக்கையை பெறுவதற்கு, கொழும்பை நெருக்குவதற்கு சர்வதேச சமூகம் என்று அழைக்கப்படும் அமெரிக்கா மற்றும் மேற்கத்திய சக்திகளுக்கு வேண்டுகோள் விடுக்கின்றன. முதலாளித்துவ அரசியல் ஸ்தாபனத்தின் ஏனைய அனைத்து கட்சிகளையும் போலவே தமிழ் முதலாளித்துவ கட்சிகள் சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்தால் கட்டளையிடப்பட்டுள்ள சிக்கன நடவடிக்கைகளை அமுல்படுத்த முழுமையாக தன்னை அர்ப்பணித்துக் கொண்டுள்ளது. இந்த ஆண்டு இறுதிக்குள் ஜனாதிபதி தேர்தல் நடைபெறக்கூடிய சாத்தியக்கூறுகளின் கீழ் தமிழ் உயரடுக்கின் சலுகைகளை உறுதிப்படுத்திக் கொள்ள எந்த வேட்பாளரை ஆதரிக்கலாம் என அவை சிந்தித்துக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றன. தமிழ் மக்கள் கூட்டணியின் தலைவர் சி.வி. விக்னேஸ்வரன் தமிழர்களின் அரசியல் பிரச்சினைகளை மக்களுக்கும் ஏனைய நாடுகளுக்கும் தெரியப்படுத்துவதற்கும் ஏனைய வேட்பாளர்கள் என்ன தருவார்கள் என அவர்களிடம் பேரம் பேசுவதற்கும் தமிழ் வேட்பாளரை நிறுத்துவதற்கு ஆதரவளிக்கின்றார். தமிழ் தேசிய கூட்டமைப்பின் ஆர். சம்பந்தனும் எம்.ஏ. சுமந்திரனும் பிரதான கட்சிகளின் வேட்பாளர்களுக்கு ஆதரவு வழங்க முன்னிற்பதோடு இதுவரைக்கும் யாரை ஆதரிப்பது என தீர்மானிக்கவில்லை. ஒரு தமிழ் வேட்பாளரை நிறுத்தினாலும் அல்லது பிரதான கட்சிகளின் வேட்பாளரை ஆதரித்தாலும் தமிழ் உயரடுக்கின் நலன்களை உறுதிப்படுத்த எது சிறந்த வழி என்பதை மட்டுமே பல்வேறு தமிழ் முதலாளித்துவ கட்சிகள் கணக்கு போடுகின்றன. தொழிலாளர்கள், இளைஞர்கள் மற்றும் மாணவர்கள் முதலாளித்துவ அரசியல் ஸ்தாபனத்தினது அனைத்து கட்சிகளின் பிற்போக்கு அரசியலையும் போலி இடது அடிவருடிகளையும் நிராகரிக்க வேண்டும். நீங்கள் சிங்களம், தமிழ் மற்றும் முஸ்லீம் என்ற வகுப்புவாத பிரிவினைகளை கடந்து இளைஞர்கள், மாணவர்கள் மற்றும் கிராமப்புற ஏழைகளை அணிதிரட்டி முதலாளித்துவ ஆட்சி முறையை தூக்கி வீசி சோசலிச கொள்கைகளுக்காக அர்ப்பணித்துக் கொண்ட தொழிலாளர்கள், விவசாயிகள் அரசாங்கத்தை ஸ்தாபிப்பதற்கான தொழிலாளர் வர்க்கத்தின் ஒன்றிணைந்த புரட்சிகர இயக்கத்துக்காக போராடுவது அவசியம். IYSSC அந்த புரட்சிகர பாதையின் வழியில் இளைஞர்கள் மற்றும் மாணவர்களை அணிதிரட்ட அவர்கள் மத்தியில் போராடுகின்றது. IYSSCயில் இணைந்து சோசலிசத்துக்கான இந்த போராட்டத்தை முன்னெடுத்து செல்ல இளைஞர்களுக்கும் மாணவர்களுக்கும் நாம் அழைப்பு விடுக்கின்றோம். நன்றி.
This year's online May Day rally has been a powerful demonstration of the revolutionary role of the international working class. We have given expression to the globally integrated character of modern society, with workers listening in from dozens of countries across every habitable continent. Today we have heard speeches from 12 countries, spanning 5 continents, given in 8 different languages, with subtitles in 10 languages, all presenting a unified revolutionary socialist perspective. The central focus of this rally has been the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, which marked the opening stages of World War III. All the catastrophes which plagued mankind in the 20th century, World War, genocide, nuclear weapons, fascism, economic crises, pandemics, have returned with a vengeance in the 21st century. The source of these problems lies in the nature of capitalism, a social system based on private ownership of the means of production and the division of the world into rival nation states. The objective crisis of world capitalism is radicalizing millions of workers, youth and intellectuals all over the world. Today we have heard reports on the powerful wave of anti-war protests against the genocide in Gaza, which have swept the globe since last October. Masses of workers and youth are horrified by the daily atrocities being committed by the Zionist state of Israel, backed to the hilt by all of the imperialist powers. There's a growing determination to struggle and ensure the very survival of humanity. This rally has placed central emphasis on the Marxist conception that the international working class is the only social force which can put an end to imperialist war, genocide, fascism, and the broader descent into capitalist barbarism. But to fulfill its revolutionary task, it needs a conscious political leadership. In the Transitional Program, the founding document of the Fourth International, written in 1938, Leon Trotsky famously wrote, quote, "The world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat." Today, with the threat of nuclear war greater than at any point in history, the task of resolving the historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat attains the most burning urgency. Without a socialist revolution, mankind faces the threat of nuclear annihilation. Therefore, as we draw this year's May Day rally to a conclusion, I urge you to make the decision today to join the ICFI and the Socialist Equality Party in your country. If you live in a country where there is not yet a section of the ICFI, fill out the form at wsws.org/join to get in contact with us. Take it upon yourself to study the history of Trotskyism, learn our program, and lay the foundations for building a new sympathizing group of the ICFI, which will ultimately become a new section of the World Trotskyist movement. In this process, there's no more valuable resource than Mehring Books and its counterparts internationally, which, as Christina outlined, publish the works of classical Marxism and the ICFI. This can be accessed at mehring.com, where we are offering a 20% discount using the promo code Mayday 2024. If you have not already, please make a generous donation today to support the work of the WSWS and the ICFI at wsws.org/donate and set up a monthly recurring donation to sustain our work going forward. Share the video of this rally as widely as possible on social media and with your co-workers, friends and family. To commemorate this May Day, the Day of International Working Class Solidarity, pledge to renew and deepen the struggle for world socialist revolution. Mobilize the working class against imperialist war. Stop the genocide in Gaza. Put an end to the threat of nuclear war. Oppose fascism and authoritarianism. Fight for a socialist public health program against COVID and future pandemics. Secure the freedom of Comrade Bogdan Sirotyuk. Students and young people, build the IYZ at your campus or city. And to everyone watching today, join and help build the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution.